let's take a deep breath, relax, and slowly explore the story of beer. Somewhere in the hills of what is now northern Israel, about 13,000 years ago, a small group of people gathered inside a limestone cave. They had come to bury their dead, to lay the bodies of loved ones into shallow graves carved from the cave floor. Among the stone bowls set into the bedrock, someone had placed a thick porridge of crushed wild wheat and barley, mixed with water, and left it to sit. Days passed in the warmth of the cave. The grain mixture began to bubble and foam as tiny, invisible creatures went to work, turning starch into sugar and sugar into alcohol. When someone eventually tasted that strange, slightly fizzy gruel, they experienced something no human being had ever knowingly consumed before: a fermented grain drink. Without realizing it, they had brewed the very first beer. This is not a guess, or a legend, or a myth passed down through the ages. In 2018, a team of researchers studied the residue left inside those stone bowls and found clear signs of a brewing process. The grain had been soaked until it sprouted, then heated, then left to ferment. 3 steps that any modern brewer would recognize. And the people who did this were not farmers. They were wandering foragers who gathered wild plants from the hillsides. They had figured out how to make beer thousands of years before anyone thought to plant a single seed in a row. Can you picture that for a moment? A group of people dressed in animal skins, standing around a stone bowl in a cave, watching their grain mixture bubble and froth. They had no idea what yeast was. They could not have known that microscopic organisms were doing the work. To them, it must have looked like magic, like the grain itself had come alive, producing warmth and foam and a mysterious liquid that changed the way they felt. And the beer they made was nothing like what you might pour from a bottle today. It was more like a thin, lumpy soup, cloudy with bits of grain floating in it, probably quite low in alcohol. They would have drunk it through reed straws, a habit that lasted for thousands of years in the ancient world. The flavor would have been sour and earthy, not something a modern drinker would call delicious. But it was something entirely new, a drink that altered the mind and created a shared experience among everyone who tasted it. Now, here is something else worth knowing. This cave was not a kitchen. It was a burial place. The beer was made as an offering to the dead. From the very beginning, beer was not just food or drink. It was something that connected the living to the dead, something woven into the most sacred moments of human life. That detail, quiet as it is, echoes through every chapter of the story we are about to tell. Half a world away, and a few thousand years later, something similar was happening in China. Along the Yellow River in a small village, people were making a fermented drink from rice, honey, and wild fruit. It was not quite beer and not quite wine, but something in between. And it showed that the same basic idea that you could leave starchy or sugary foods alone for a while and they would turn into something pleasantly intoxicating was being discovered independently by people on opposite sides of the planet. In fact, the discovery of fermentation was almost certainly not a single event. It happened again and again wherever humans gathered and stored grain or fruit in warm conditions. Wild yeast is everywhere, drifting on breezes, clinging to the skins of fruit, lurking on the surfaces of pots and bowls. Any starchy liquid left standing for a few days in warm weather will begin to ferment on its own. The first beers were not inventions. They were happy accidents, discovered and rediscovered countless times across thousands of years and thousands of miles. And it may go even deeper than that. Scientists have noticed that chimpanzees and other great apes sometimes seek out naturally fermented fruit, suggesting that the taste for alcohol may be older than our species itself. One theory holds that our distant ancestors evolved a preference for the smell and taste of alcohol because it was a reliable sign of ripe, energy-rich fruit. If that is true, then the human fondness for a cold drink at the end of the day is not something we learn. It is something written into our very nature, passed down through millions of years. But there is a vast difference between an ape nibbling on fermented fruit and a group of people processing 7 types of grain through a careful 3-step brewing sequence. By 13,000 years ago, humans had crossed a line. They were no longer stumbling upon fermented drinks by accident. They were making them on purpose, refining the methods, and weaving the results into their most important ceremonies. At a place called Göbekli Tepe, in what is now southeastern Turkey, there stands one of the most mysterious structures ever built. Around 11,000 years ago, long before anyone had cities or farms or written language, groups of wandering people carved enormous stone pillars, some weighing as much as 20 tons, and arranged them in great circles on a hilltop. No one lived there permanently. It was a gathering place, a site for rituals and feasts. And at the base of those pillars, researchers found large stone basins, some big enough to hold more than 40 gallons of liquid, with traces of fermented grain inside them. The people who built this place, it seems, were fueled by beer. Communal drinking may have been the very thing that brought them together and kept them working side by side on a project that would have seemed impossible for any one person alone. And so the story of beer begins not in a factory or a laboratory, not with a recipe or a brand name, but in a cave and on a hilltop, with mourners and builders, with offerings to the dead and feasts for the living. It begins with the quiet discovery that the world is full of invisible forces waiting to transform something ordinary into something that brings pleasure, meaning, and connection. Everything that follows in this story, the rise of cities, the invention of writing, the building of empires, all of it can be traced, in some small but real way, back to that first bewildering sip. Let us see where the story goes from here. There is a question that has quietly haunted the world of archaeology for more than 70 years, and it goes like this. Why did human beings first begin to grow grain? The obvious answer, the one most people would give, is bread. Grain can be ground into flour, mixed with water, and baked into food that keeps well and travels easily. But in 1953, at the University of Chicago, an archaeologist named Robert Braidwood put that question to a panel of experts, and one of them offered a very different answer. Perhaps, he suggested, the reason people first started farming was not to make bread at all. Perhaps it was to brew beer. The idea sounded strange at the time. Braidwood himself dismissed it, but it refused to go away. Here is why the idea has such staying power. Wild grain in its natural state is remarkably hard to turn into bread. The tiny, tough kernels of wild wheat and barley need an enormous amount of work, grinding with heavy stones, winnowing away the husks, baking at high temperatures, just to produce something you could chew. The energy you spend making bread from wild grain is almost more than the energy you get back from eating it. But those same grains, when soaked in water and allowed to sprout, produce sugars that wild yeast can ferment with almost no effort at all. In other words, it is actually easier to make beer from wild grain than it is to make bread. The sprouting does most of the hard work for you, and the fermentation happens on its own. All you need is time and warmth. In the 1980s, 2 researchers took this idea further. They argued that early humans, having stumbled upon the pleasurable effects of fermented grain, would have had a powerful reason to make sure they always had grain nearby. And that desire, that craving for a reliable supply of brewing ingredients, might have been one of the things that pushed people to stop wandering and start planting seeds. It was a bold idea, and for a long time it lacked the evidence to be taken seriously. Then came the discovery we talked about earlier in that limestone cave in Israel. The people who made beer there were doing it at least 13,000 years ago, 3,000 years before anyone is known to have planted a crop. If people were already brewing beer from wild grain they had gathered by hand, and if that beer mattered enough to be offered to their dead, then the leap from foraging to farming starts to look a little different. It starts to look less like a plan for better nutrition and more like a way to make sure the beer never ran out. The evidence stretches far beyond the hills of Israel. In the Americas, the wild ancestor of corn is a grass with tiny, nearly useless kernels locked inside a hard shell. It would have made terrible food, but it would have been perfectly good for making a fermented drink. The fact that ancient people in Mexico spent centuries carefully breeding this unpromising plant into something useful makes much more sense if their goal was fermentation rather than nutrition. And then there is Göbekli Tepe, the great stone circle in Turkey that we visited in the last section. This gathering place was built by people who did not yet farm. The construction required hundreds of workers, dragging enormous stone pillars across the landscape without the help of animals or wheels. What brought them together? What kept them working? The large stone basins at the site, some capable of holding more than 160 liters of liquid, tell part of the story. Traces of fermented grain were found inside them. Some archaeologists believe that the need to supply this gathering place with a steady flow of grain for brewing is what finally pushed the people of the surrounding region to begin planting wild wheat in their fields. The sequence, if this is true, is rather beautiful. Ritual gatherings required feasts, and feasts required beer, and beer required grain. And the need for grain in quantities that wandering and gathering could not reliably provide created the reason to settle down and farm. Not everyone agrees, of course. Some scholars argue that the question of bread versus beer is too simple, that the move to farming was driven by many things at once: population growth, climate change, the depletion of wild food sources, and the social pressures of increasingly complex communities. One archaeologist has suggested that the real driving force was competitive feasting, a practice in which ambitious leaders hosted elaborate parties to build their reputation. Beer, with its power to alter the mood and loosen the tongue, would have been a particularly useful tool in those competitions. The host who could provide the best feast with the most beer would earn the most loyalty. But whatever the precise mix of causes, the old idea that beer came before bread has gained enough support to be taken seriously by the experts. We now know for certain that beer production came before farming. Any explanation of why humans started growing crops must reckon with the possibility that fermentation played a role. What is beyond doubt is that once people did begin to farm, beer production grew rapidly. The earliest farming villages of the ancient Near East, dating to roughly 9,000 years before the present, have left behind grinding stones, large pottery jars, and charred grain. And while not all of that grain was destined for the brewing pot, a good portion of it almost certainly was. By the time the first cities rose along the rivers of what is now Iraq, around 6,000 years ago, beer was already one of the pillars of civilization. It was drunk every day by rich and poor alike, used to pay workers, offered to the gods, and governed by law. There is something quietly wonderful about this idea, if you sit with it for a moment. For most of recorded history, beer has been looked down on by people of high culture as a lowly drink, something for laborers and peasants. But if the theory is even partly right, then this humble, bubbling grain drink deserves credit for one of the most important changes in all of human history, the moment when wandering people stopped, settled down, planted seeds, and began to build the world we know. The next time you see a glass of beer, you might consider that you are looking at the drink that helped start civilization itself. And now, let us travel to the land between two rivers, where the story of beer was about to be written down for the very first time. Around 4,000 years ago, in the flat, sun-baked lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a scribe pressed a reed stylus into a soft clay tablet and began to write a hymn. The words were not addressed to a great warrior or a conquering king. They were addressed to the goddess of brewing, whose name meant something like the lady who fills the mouth. The hymn described in beautiful and careful detail the process of making beer, from the preparation of a special twice-baked bread, to the mixing of the mash, to the straining of the liquid, to the collection of the finished drink in vessels set in a cool stream. It may have been a song. It may have been a memory aid meant to help brewers remember the correct sequence of steps. But whatever its original purpose, this hymn is one of the oldest detailed descriptions of beer making in all of human history. And it tells us something important about the people who wrote it. This was a civilization that thought the act of brewing was worthy of divine praise. The land of Sumer in what is now southern Iraq was one of the earliest urban civilizations on Earth. By around 4,000 years before the present, its cities, places with names like Uruk, and Lagash, were home to tens of thousands of people. And beer was at the center of everything. It was not a luxury. It was a staple as basic to daily life as bread itself. The workers who built the great step temples and maintained the vast canal systems that watered the fields received beer as part of their daily pay. The amount was carefully recorded on clay tablets down to the last measure. Ordinary laborers got about 1 3/4 liters each day. Senior officials and high priests could receive 5 times as much. Beer, in a very real sense, was the currency that kept the entire economy running. The variety of beer available was far more than you might expect from a world so ancient. Texts from Sumer mention at least 8 different types, and records from one city list as many as 19. There were dark beers and light beers, sweet beers and bitter beers, beers made from barley and beers made from wheat, beers flavored with dates and beers brewed with spices. Some were thick and porridge-like, meant as much for nourishment as for pleasure. Others were lighter, closer to what we would recognize as a drink. This variety points to a long history of experimentation, a culture where brewers competed and consumers had opinions. One of the most charming details of life in ancient Sumer is how people drank their beer. Because the beer was unfiltered, full of floating bits of grain and husk, you could not simply raise a cup to your lips without getting a mouthful of mush. Instead, people drank through long straws, sometimes tipped with fine metal filters made of gold, silver, or copper. Archaeologists have found elegant drinking straws buried alongside wealthy people in the royal tombs of the city of dating to about 4,600 years ago. The dead were sent into the next life with their drinking equipment, and images carved into small stone seals show groups of people gathered around a large shared pot, each person sipping through their own straw. Can you picture that for a moment? A group of friends or family, seated together in the warm evening air, each one connected to the same vessel by a long reed straw, sharing the same drink. It is a lovely image, and one that tells you a great deal about what beer meant to these people. It brought them together, literally and figuratively. The laws of the land took beer very seriously. The famous legal code of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, written about 3,700 years ago, included several laws specifically about beer and tavern keeping. One decreed that any tavern keeper who shortchanged a customer by pouring a smaller measure than what was paid for would be convicted and thrown into the river. Another required tavern keepers to report any conspirators who met in their establishments on pain of death. The punishments were severe, and they tell us just how important beer was to the social order. It was too central to daily life to be left unregulated. And here is a detail that is worth pausing on. Nearly all of the tavern keepers mentioned in those ancient laws are women. This was no accident. In Sumer, brewing was overwhelmingly a female profession. Women brewed beer at home as part of their daily work, and those who made extra could sell it, running small taverns that served as important gathering places for their neighborhoods. The word for brewer in the Sumerian language was grammatically feminine. The goddess of beer was female. The mythological tradition consistently linked the art of brewing with female creativity. This gave women a rare degree of independence in a society where most other paths to wealth and influence were closed to them. The tavern was their workshop, their business, and their source of autonomy. It would take thousands of years and the rise of commercial guilds run by men before women would be pushed out of the profession they had invented. Beer was also deeply woven into religious life. The great temples of Sumerian cities maintained their own breweries, staffed by workers who produced the enormous quantities of beer needed for daily offerings to the gods and for the great festival celebrations that marked the calendar. Drinking together from a communal vessel was a ritual of trust and fellowship, a way of reinforcing the bonds that held communities together. In 1989, a brewery in San Francisco attempted to recreate the beer described in that ancient hymn. Working with scholars who had spent their careers studying the language and culture of Sumer, they used twice-baked bread made from sprouted barley, dates as a sweetener, and natural fermentation to produce a drink they named after the brewing goddess. The result, by all accounts, was light and slightly bubbly, with a gentle scent of dates, something like a sour, effervescent ale. It was not quite like any beer you can buy today, but it offered a brief and lovely connection to a world 4,000 years gone. The legacy of Sumer runs through everything that follows in the story of beer. The basic ingredients, the fundamental process, the social rituals of drinking together, the idea of paying workers in beer, the urge to regulate quality and price, even the question of who gets to brew and who profits from it. All of these themes first appear in the clay records of Sumer, and they will appear again and again as our story moves forward. Let us travel now to the banks of the Nile, where another great civilization was building its world on a foundation of grain and foam. In the shadow of the Great Pyramid, roughly 45 centuries ago, a laborer balanced a heavy basket of limestone on his shoulder and shuffled toward the rising monument. He was one of thousands of workers, organized into teams with colorful names like Friends of the King and Drunkards of the Pharaoh, who spent years hauling and lifting the millions of stone blocks that would become one of the great wonders of the ancient world. When the sun finally dropped below the western desert, this man and his fellow workers returned to their village at the base of the plateau. And there, waiting for them, was the most important part of their daily pay. Not gold, not silver, not even bread alone, but beer. Each worker received roughly 4 to 5 liters of it every day, served 3 times alongside bread, onions, and garlic. The beer was thick and nourishing, more like a liquid meal than a drink. And it was so central to the entire operation that some historians have said, only partly joking, that the pyramids were built on beer. These workers were not slaves, as older stories once claimed. They were skilled and semi-skilled laborers drawn from villages across Egypt, many of them working in 3-month shifts as a form of labor service. Their willingness to do this back-breaking work depended in large part on the quality and reliability of their food and drink. The archaeological record at Giza reveals a remarkably well-organized supply system. Bakeries and breweries operated side by side within the workers' village, producing enough bread and beer to feed a force of 10 to 20,000 people. And this was no coincidence. In Egypt, baking and brewing were 2 halves of the same craft. The Egyptian way of making beer was distinctive. It began with bread. Grain was ground into a coarse flour, mixed with water and sometimes dates, and baked into large, porous loaves. But these loaves were deliberately left half-baked, still doughy and starchy on the inside. The loaves were then crumbled into large clay pots filled with water, and the mixture was left to ferment. Wild yeast, clinging to the bread and drifting in the warm air, did the rest. The result was a thick, cloudy drink, packed with bits of grain, rich in vitamins and protein. It was, by every measure, a genuinely nutritious food. For the working people of ancient Egypt, beer was not a treat or a luxury. It was how they kept body and soul together. In 2021, archaeologists announced the discovery of what they called the oldest large-scale brewery ever found, buried beneath the sands of a place called Abydos in southern Egypt. Dating to about 5,000 years ago, the very dawn of the age of the pharaohs, This brewery contained dozens of large ceramic pots arranged in neat rows, supported by rings of dried mud. The estimated output was staggering, roughly 22,000 liters in a single batch, enough to fill a small swimming pool. This was not a family kitchen. This was an industrial operation, organized by the state, designed to supply the burial ceremonies of Egypt's earliest kings with the vast amounts of beer they demanded. Beer was a state priority from the very beginning. Beer touched every corner of Egyptian life. It was drunk at meals and offered at temples. It was prescribed by doctors and placed in tombs to nourish the dead on their journey to the afterlife. Paintings on the walls of ancient tombs show the entire brewing process in beautiful detail. Women grinding grain, kneading dough, straining the fermenting mixture through woven sieves, and sealing the finished beer in tall jars for storage. These images give us a vivid window into a craft that was practiced in royal workshops and humble homes alike. The doctors of ancient Egypt used beer in dozens of remedies. One famous medical text, written about 3,500 years ago, lists beer as an ingredient in treatments for stomach troubles, skin conditions, eye infections, and general tiredness. It was mixed with herbs, honey, or animal fat to create medicines that patients could actually tolerate. Whether these treatments worked as the doctors hoped is another question, but the fact that beer appeared so often in the medical texts tells us how deeply it was woven into every aspect of daily life. And then there was the goddess. Her name was Hathor, and she was one of the most beloved figures in all of Egyptian religion, the goddess of joy, love, music, dance, and quite notably, drunkenness. Her festivals, known as the Feasts of Drunkenness, were occasions of deliberate, joyful intoxication, where worshippers drank beer and wine as a form of communion with the divine. There is a wonderful myth that explains why. According to the story, the sun god once sent a fierce lioness to punish humanity for its disobedience, but the lioness grew so bloodthirsty that she threatened to destroy everyone. To stop her, the gods ordered 7,000 jars of beer to be brewed and mixed with red coloring to look like blood. The beer was poured across the fields. The lioness, mistaking it for blood, drank it all, fell into a deep sleep, and when she awoke, her fury had passed. She became Hathor, the gentle one. And so, in Egyptian myth, beer literally saved the world. Egyptian beer was not a single product. Ancient texts mention sweet beer, dark beer, thick beer, and beer of the festival, among many others. The finest beers went to the gods and the wealthy. Weaker, more watered-down versions were the everyday drink of farmers and laborers. Some were flavored with dates, honey, or spices, adding sweetness and depth to the basic grain brew. The scale of beer production across Egypt is hard to overstate. The Abydos brewery was just one facility in one city at one moment in time. Similar operations existed across the entire country, supplying temples, palaces, and construction projects. The soldiers who defended the borders, the priests who tended the temples, the scribes who kept the records, all of them received beer as part of their daily rations. Tax records from later periods list enormous quantities of beer produced and distributed by state-run breweries. The entire functioning of the Egyptian state depended, to a remarkable degree, on the steady flow of this thick, golden drink. For nearly 3,000 years, beer remained the lifeblood of Egypt. It fed the living, nourished the dead, pleased the gods, and kept the great machine of the state running smoothly. When Greek travelers eventually arrived and saw how much beer the Egyptians drank, they were astonished. To the wine-loving Greeks, this grain drink was a curiosity, something slightly beneath them. But to the Egyptians, beer was a gift from the gods, the sustenance of workers and pharaohs alike, and the quiet foundation on which their entire world was built. And it is to those wine-loving Greeks and their complicated feelings about beer that we turn next. In the 1st century of the Common Era, a Roman writer sat in his study and composed a passage about the drinking habits of the peoples who lived beyond the borders of the empire. He described a hazy drink made from grains soaked in water, a drink the Gauls and the Iberians consumed in great quantities. He noted, with grudging respect, that these people had found clever ways to produce foam and to keep the drink fresh. But his tone was unmistakable. To a cultured Roman, wine was the drink of civilization, the gift of the gods, the nectar that flowed at grand feasts and philosophical discussions. Beer was something else entirely, a crude drink for the barbarian peoples who lurked at the edges of the civilized world. This divide between wine and beer, between what was considered refined and what was considered rough, was one of the most lasting ideas to come out of the ancient world. Its echoes are still with us today. The ancient Greeks, who saw themselves as the height of human culture, looked at beer drinkers with a mix of amusement and disdain. The great poet Homer, who wrote of heroes feasting and fighting across the wine-dark sea, never once mentions beer in his stories. Wine was everywhere in the Greek world. It was mixed with water and served at elegant drinking parties called symposia, where philosophers debated the meaning of life and poets recited their verses. Beer had no place at that table. One Greek playwright reportedly mocked the Egyptians for their fondness for grain drink. Another writer, describing a long march through the highlands of Armenia, noted that the locals stored a fermented barley drink in large clay pots and sipped it through reed straws. He found it pleasantly strong, but quite unlike wine. For the Greeks, growing grapes and making wine was a mark of sophistication, something that separated them from the rest of the world. Beer was what other people drank, people who had not yet reached the heights of Greek learning. The Romans inherited this attitude and made it even stronger. In the Roman view, wine was the drink of citizens, of senators, of gods. It stood at the center of religious ceremonies, social gatherings, and the rituals of daily life. The Latin language itself reflected this feeling. The word for wine carried connotations of culture and elegance. Beer had no dignified Latin name at all, only borrowed words from the languages of the people who brewed it. When Roman soldiers marched north across the Alps and west across the Rhine, they carried their wine culture with them, planting vineyards wherever the climate allowed and importing wine at great cost where it did not. The large clay jars used to ship wine across the sea have been found at Roman sites all across northern Europe, proof of the lengths to which Romans would go to avoid drinking beer. But the reality, as is so often the case, was more complicated than the official story. Beer was alive and well within the empire itself, particularly in the provinces of Egypt, Spain, and what is now France, where it had deep roots stretching back long before the Romans arrived. In Egypt, which had been brewing for 3,000 years before the first Roman soldier set foot on its soil, the local people continued to drink beer in enormous quantities, regardless of what their Greek and Roman rulers thought about it. Roman Egypt became a curious spectacle, a wine-drinking elite presiding over a beer-drinking population, a cultural divide that mirrored broader tensions between the rulers and the ruled. Roman soldiers stationed along the cold northern borders frequently drank beer too. Sometimes wine was simply too expensive or too hard to get. Sometimes the soldiers had developed a genuine taste for the local brew. Archaeologists have found grain stores, malting floors, and brewing equipment at Roman military camps in Britain and along the rivers of Central Europe. Even the Roman army, for all its cultural pride, was practical enough to drink whatever was at hand. The Celtic peoples of what is now France, Britain, and Spain had their own rich beer culture, stretching back centuries before they ever encountered a Roman. They brewed a drink from barley or wheat, flavored with herbs, honey, and sometimes fruit. A Greek traveler who visited Gaul described wild Celtic banquets where warriors competed for the best cuts of meat and drank themselves into a state that both impressed and horrified him. The word the Gauls used for their brew, something close to cerveza, lives on today in the Spanish word for beer. East of the Rhine, the Germanic tribes were equally devoted to their grain drink. A Roman writer composing a description of the Germans and their customs noted their love of drinking contests and their tendency toward noisy arguments once the beer had flowed a little too freely. He was not entirely fair in his portrait. He was partly using the Germans as a mirror to criticize what he saw as Roman decadence, but his description of a culture built around communal drinking, generous hospitality, and feasting to seal alliances matches what archaeologists have found. And then the empire fell. In the 5th century, the Roman world crumbled, and the Germanic peoples who had been drinking beer for thousands of years settled across the lands that had once been ruled by Rome. The Franks, the Goths, the Lombards, they brought their brewing traditions with them. The old frontier between wine and beer began to blur and, in many regions, disappeared entirely. The Christian church found itself in an awkward position. Wine was essential to the most sacred ritual, the ceremony at the heart of Christian worship. But in the cold, damp lands of northern Europe, grapes would not grow, and beer was the only fermented drink available. The tension between the church's love of wine and the northern reality of beer would shape the next 1,000 years of brewing history, as monks picked up the art of making beer and turned their monasteries into some of the finest breweries in the world. As for the old Roman contempt for beer, it lingered for a remarkably long time. For centuries, wine remained the drink of the wealthy and the educated, while beer was seen as something for common people. But the common people, as it turned out, had the last laugh. Beer outlasted the Roman Empire, survived the fall of civilizations, and adapted to every climate and culture it met. The drink that the Romans dismissed as a barbarian imitation of wine went on to become the most widely consumed alcoholic drink in human history. And now, let us widen our view and travel far beyond the borders of Europe to the many places around the world where people were brewing their own remarkable beers, each one a story all its own. High in the Andes Mountains, in the ancient capital of the Inca Empire, a sacred ritual unfolded at what was considered the center of the known world. The ruler of an empire stretching thousands of miles along the spine of South America raised a golden bowl filled with a thick, cloudy drink brewed from fermented corn. He poured it into a stone basin at the Temple of the Sun, and the liquid cascaded down a channel into the earth, an offering to the sun god himself. Thousands of specially chosen women had spent weeks preparing this drink, carefully chewing kernels of corn to begin the process of breaking down the starches, then spitting the softened paste into clay vessels and leaving it to ferment. In the Inca world, this corn beer was not simply a drink. It was a sacrament, a way of speaking to the gods, and the most important ritual substance in the largest empire the Americas had ever known. This drink, called chicha, has a history stretching back thousands of years before the Inca. Pottery from the Andes dating to roughly 7,000 years ago suggests that fermented corn drinks were already being made long before any great empire rose. At one ancient site in southern Peru, archaeologists found the remains of a large brewery that produced hundreds of liters of corn beer for ceremonial feasts. When the people who ran that site finally abandoned it, they held one last feast, drank the final batch, and then burned the brewery to the ground and smashed every drinking vessel, rather than let anyone else use them. That is how deeply the place mattered. And the chewing method, while certainly real and important, was not the only way the people of the Andes made their beer. Recent discoveries have shown that they also used a more sophisticated technique, sprouting the corn to convert its starches into sugar, much the same way barley has been malted in Europe for thousands of years. The Spanish who first arrived in the Americas focused almost entirely on the chewing method, which they found both disturbing and strangely compelling, and their accounts shaped the way Europeans imagined Andean brewing for centuries. But the truth was more nuanced. These were skilled brewers with a diverse set of techniques. Chicha itself was not a single drink but a whole family of fermented beverages. While corn chicha was the most widespread, people across the Americas also brewed from quinoa, berries, peanuts, and a starchy root called manioc. In the rainforests of the Amazon, manioc beer remains a staple to this day. Each variety had its own preparation, its own occasions, and its own place in the social world. Now let us cross the Atlantic to Africa, where an entirely separate tradition of grain-based brewing had been flourishing for thousands of years. Sorghum, a grain native to the continent, has been cultivated for at least 5,000 years. Across the vast savannas and river valleys of sub-Saharan Africa, people developed an extraordinary range of fermented drinks using sorghum, millet, corn, and other local crops. Researchers have documented hundreds of distinct brews, each with its own name, recipe, and meaning. In southern Africa, there is a traditional beer made from corn, sorghum, and water, brewed with wild yeast and a type of natural souring that gives it a distinctive tang. The brewing begins by soaking the grain overnight in warm water, allowing a gentle sourness to develop. Then, the mixture is boiled, cooled, and given fresh malt to start the alcohol fermentation. The traditional test for whether the brew is ready is beautifully simple. You hold a lit match near the surface of the fermenting pot, and if it goes out quickly, snuffed by the carbon dioxide bubbling up from below, the beer is done. The finished drink is thick, slightly pink, and quite sour, and it is consumed while still alive with fermentation, giving it a lively fizz. This beer, like so many traditional brews around the world, was typically made by women, and it was prepared for the occasions that mattered most: weddings, funerals, harvest celebrations, and ceremonies to honor the ancestors. The drink served as a bridge between the living and the dead, a theme we have already seen in the burial cave in Israel and in the temples of Sumer. Across the African continent, similar beers go by dozens of names, each one a unique expression of a brewing tradition that grew entirely on its own, with no connection to the beers of Europe or the Near East. The modern history of this traditional African beer, however, carries a darker chapter. In South Africa, the colonial and later the apartheid government took control of its production, running beer halls as a way to manage and profit from the lives of black workers. The beer halls became symbols of oppression, sites of protest and resistance. The association of traditional beer with exploitation led many people to turn away from it, choosing commercially produced lagers instead. The story of this beer in the 20th century is a reminder that beer can be both a source of identity and a tool of control. Let us now travel to the far north. In Finland, another ancient brewing tradition has survived against remarkable odds. There is a farmhouse ale brewed from barley and rye and flavored not with hops but with juniper branches that is one of the oldest continuously brewed styles of beer in existence. Traces of what appears to be this kind of beer were found aboard a sunken ship from the age of the Vikings dating to the 9th century, and the tradition itself is almost certainly much older. The way this Finnish beer is made is unlike anything in the modern brewing world. There is no boiling step. Instead, the brewer slowly raises the temperature of the grain and water mixture over many hours, coaxing out the sugars in a long, patient process. The liquid is then filtered through a special wooden trough lined with juniper branches, which serve as both a strainer and a source of flavor, giving the finished beer a woodsy, piney character that is immediately recognizable. The best recipes were closely guarded family secrets, passed from one generation to the next, and the beer was reserved for the celebrations that marked the turning points of life. Today, this Finnish beer holds a protected status in Europe, meaning that only beer brewed in Finland according to the old methods can carry the name. These traditions from around the world, corn beer in the Andes, sorghum beer in Africa, juniper ale in Finland, rice drinks in Asia, and countless others remind us of something important. Beer is not a European invention. Fermentation is a universal human discovery, arrived at independently by people on every inhabited continent, using whatever starchy or sugary ingredients were close at hand. Long before European ships carried barley and hops to distant shores, the peoples of the Americas, Africa, and Asia had been brewing for thousands of years, creating beer cultures as rich and meaningful as anything produced in the ancient Near East. And now, let us return to medieval Europe, where a quiet revolution was taking place behind the walls of monasteries as monks picked up the brewer's craft and transformed it into something the world had never seen before. In the year 724, a bishop named Corbinian traveled south from the Rhineland to the forested hills of Upper Bavaria, where he established a small monastic community near the town of Freising. The monks who gathered there followed a strict daily routine of prayer, study, and manual labor. Among those labors was the brewing of beer. It served several purposes at once. It provided a nutritious drink that was allowed even during the many periods of fasting required by the religious calendar, because liquid nourishment, the monks reasoned, did not count as breaking the fast. It offered a safer alternative to the often dirty local water, and it could be sold to travelers and pilgrims passing through, bringing in money to support the community. By the year 1040, this monastery had obtained a formal license to brew, a date that it claims, with considerable pride, as the founding of the oldest continuously operating brewery in the world. Whether that claim is strictly true is a matter some scholars like to argue about. Other monasteries have put forward their own competing dates. But what no one disputes is the extraordinary role that monasteries played in shaping the beer we know today. Between roughly the 6th and the 16th centuries, monks and nuns across Europe were among the most skilled, disciplined, and productive brewers on the continent. Their contributions to the art and science of making beer are hard to overstate. The rule that governed monastic life, written by a man named Benedict of Nursia around the year 530, did not specifically require the monks to brew beer, but it created a way of life that made brewing almost inevitable. The rule required monks to be self-sufficient, to provide for their own food and shelter through their own labor. It demanded generous hospitality toward guests, requiring every monastery to feed and shelter travelers, pilgrims, and the poor. And it addressed the question of drink, allowing roughly half a pint of wine per day, but acknowledging that in regions where wine was hard to get, other drinks might take its place. In Northern Europe, where grapes struggled to grow and wine had to be imported at great expense from the south, beer was the natural and necessary choice. A famous 9th century document, a detailed plan for the layout of an ideal monastery in Switzerland, included not one but 3 separate breweries. One was for the monks themselves, one was for pilgrims and guests, and one was for the poor. Each produced beer of a different strength, reflecting the social order of the medieval world. The monks received the strongest and most carefully made beer. The guests received a respectable middle-strength version, and the poor received a thinner, lighter brew. Records from some monasteries indicate that each monk received roughly 5 quarts of beer per day, a generous amount that reflected beer's role as a genuine source of nourishment rather than a simple pleasure. During the long weeks of fasting before certain holidays, beer rations were often increased to make up for the lack of solid food. This led to the creation of especially rich, strong fasting beers that could sustain a monk through 40 days of going without meals. These are the ancestors of a style of beer that is still brewed and enjoyed today. There is a wonderful story about one such fasting beer. The monks of a monastery in Munich developed a particularly strong brew for their period of fasting, and feeling uncertain about whether drinking something so rich and satisfying truly counted as self-denial, decided to send a barrel to Rome for approval by the head of the church. The barrel traveled across the Alps in the heat of summer, jostled and shaken along the way, and arrived in Rome badly spoiled. The taste was so sour and unpleasant that the judgment came back with a blessing. Drinking such a terrible liquid, the reasoning went, was surely a form of suffering, not a pleasure. The monks were free to continue. They brewed on, and the beer they made became the model for a style that remains popular to this day. Monasteries were perfectly suited to advance the craft of brewing, and it is worth pausing to understand why. First, they were among the most stable institutions in all of medieval Europe. Kingdoms rose and fell. Wars swept through the land, but the monasteries endured, sometimes for centuries without interruption. This stability allowed brewing knowledge to be passed down from one generation of monks to the next, building slowly over time. Second, monks could read and write, which was extremely rare in the medieval world. They recorded their observations and their recipes, creating a body of brewing knowledge that would have been impossible in a world that relied only on memory and word of mouth. Third, monasteries controlled large tracts of farmland for growing grain and hops, had access to clean well water, and possessed the resources to invest in proper brewing equipment. And fourth, the monastic way of life, with its emphasis on discipline, patience, and careful attention to detail, imposed a rigor on the brewing process that resulted in more consistent, higher quality beer than most ordinary brewers could manage. The monks of one Bavarian monastery were among the first known brewers to cultivate their own hop gardens, placing them at the leading edge of a revolution in beer production. Long before hops became the standard ingredient in European beer, monastic brewers were experimenting with this bitter climbing plant, discovering through patient trial and error that it not only improved the taste, but also helped the beer last much longer without spoiling. A Benedictine abbess, a woman of extraordinary learning who lived in the 12th century, wrote that hops, because of their bitterness, helped keep drinks from going bad, allowing them to last much longer. This observation, one of the earliest descriptions of the preservative power of hops in Europe, reflects the practical knowledge that monastic brewers had been building for generations. The Belgian tradition of monastery brewing represents the pinnacle and the living continuation of this long story. The monks of a strict branch of the Cistercian order known as the Trappists began brewing in the region of modern-day Belgium during the medieval period. When many of their monasteries were shut down during the upheavals that followed the French Revolution, the tradition very nearly disappeared. But after Belgium gained its independence in 1830, the monasteries reopened and their brewing traditions were revived with renewed energy, producing ales of remarkable quality that would eventually gain admirers around the world. Today, the Trappist name is strictly protected. For a beer to carry that label, it must be brewed within the walls of a Trappist monastery. The monks must play a genuine role in its production, and the profits must support the monastery and its charitable works. Only 14 monasteries in the entire world hold this certification. The monastic brewing tradition gave the world more than just better beer. It established the idea that brewing was a craft worthy of serious attention, careful record-keeping, and continuous improvement. In an age when most brewing was a casual household task, monks approached it with the same devotion they brought to their prayers and their manuscripts. They were, in every meaningful sense, the world's first professional brewers. And yet, for all their innovation, there was one ingredient the monks did not always use, one that would spark a struggle between old power and new ideas. That ingredient was hops, and the fight over it would reshape the entire world of beer. In a stone building in medieval Cologne, sometime around the year 1420, the town council issued an unusual order. A woman whose name has been lost to time was directed to teach one specific brewer, and no one else, the closely guarded secrets of making a certain herbal mixture. This instruction, preserved in the city's records, opens a window onto one of the most intriguing chapters in the history of beer. For centuries before hops became the standard flavoring in European beer, brewers relied on a mysterious blend of herbs whose recipe was a jealously protected secret, controlled by the church and feudal lords, and worth a great deal of money. This herbal mixture was called Gruit, and its story is one of secrecy, power, and control. Gruit was not a single herb, but a blend of several plants combined in proportions that varied from one region to another and were often kept hidden. The most common ingredient was a shrub that grows in the wet bogs and swamps of northern Europe, a bitter-leafed plant whose tiny resin glands gave the beer a complex, aromatic flavor. Alongside it, brewers might add a type of wild rosemary with mildly intoxicating properties, a flowering herb long used in folk medicine, and various other plants, including berries, seeds, and roots. Some historical records even mention a member of the nightshade family, a plant with genuinely dangerous effects, including hallucinations and a strange sensation of floating. The exact combination depended on the brewer, the region, and whatever was at hand. The beer that resulted from these herbs tasted nothing like the hopped beer most people drink today. Modern brewers who have tried to recreate Gruit ales describe them as herbal, resinous, and warmly bitter, without the sharp, refreshing bite that hops provide. Some of the ingredients may have produced effects beyond ordinary drunkenness, a more stimulating, sometimes even dreamlike intoxication that set Gruit beer apart from anything a modern drinker would expect. One theory suggests that the shift from Gruit to hops coincided with a broader cultural movement towards sobriety and self-control, and that there may have been something about the old herbal beers that the reformers of the age found troubling. But the real story of Gruit is not about the herbs themselves. It is about power. The right to produce and sell Gruit was a privilege that could be granted by the emperor, and it was typically held by bishops, abbots, and feudal lords. This privilege was known by a German term that roughly translates to the Gruit right, and it worked as a lucrative monopoly. Brewers were forbidden from making beer without first purchasing their Gruit from the authorized supplier, and the price was set by whoever held the monopoly. In practice, this meant that every batch of beer brewed in a given territory generated a payment to the local bishop or lord. It was, in effect, a hidden tax on beer, and it was enormously profitable. In some medieval cities, the revenue from Gruit was one of the single largest sources of income for the church or the local government, rivaling tolls on trade and taxes on land. Can you imagine what this meant for everyday life? Every time a brewer stirred a new batch of beer, money flowed upward to the powerful. Every tavern, every household, every celebration that involved beer, and they nearly all did, enriched the holders of the Gruit monopoly. The revenue funded the building of churches, the maintenance of monasteries, and the lifestyles of feudal lords. Any threat to the Gruit system was a threat to the entire power structure of medieval Northern Europe. And so, when hops began to appear as an alternative, the reaction from the Gruit monopolists was fierce. They fought back with every tool they had. They passed laws forbidding the use of hops. They imposed economic penalties on brewers who abandoned Gruit. They even made religious arguments claiming that hops were unhealthy, ungodly, or simply wrong. The people who profited from the old system had no intention of giving it up without a fight. The conflict between Gruit and hops was, at its heart, a power struggle. On one side stood the old guard, the bishops and lords who controlled the herbal monopoly and the wealth it generated. On the other stood a new class of urban merchants, brewing guilds, and city governments who saw in hops a chance to break free from feudal control. Hops could be grown by anyone with a suitable patch of land. You did not need to buy them from a monopoly supplier. Switching to hops meant that the cost of brewing dropped, the quality improved, and the profits stayed closer to the brewer and the city rather than flowing to the church. The transition happened slowly over several centuries at different speeds in different places. In northern Germany and the Netherlands, where powerful trading networks promoted hopped beer as a valuable commodity, the change came relatively quickly between the 1200s and the 1400s. In other regions, particularly where a powerful bishop held the Gruit rights, the old system clung on stubbornly, sometimes lasting well into the 1500s, long after hopped beer had taken over nearly everywhere else. The eventual victory of hops was not just a change in what beer tasted like. It was a small revolution in the economic and political order of Europe, a moment when market forces and the desire for independence won out over feudal privilege. Today, a handful of modern craft brewers have begun to revive Gruit, producing ales flavored with the old herbal blends as a way of connecting with a tradition that has been largely forgotten for 500 years. These contemporary Gruit ales offer a glimpse of what medieval beer might have tasted like, with their complex, unfamiliar aromas and their lack of the crisp bitterness that hops provide. Some drinkers find them a revelation, others find them deeply strange. But nobody can recreate the originals exactly, because the precise recipes used by the medieval Gruit makers were secrets that died with their keepers, carried to the grave by those nameless women and men who understood, in a way we can now only guess at, the subtle art of blending herbs to make the perfect brew. The story of Gruit reminds us that the history of beer is never just about taste. It is always, at some level, about power. Who controls what goes into the brew? Who profits from its sale? Who decides what is allowed and what is not? These questions, first fought over in the herb markets of medieval Europe, would return again and again in the centuries to come. And so let us turn now to the ingredient that won the fight, the bitter flower that would conquer the beer world entirely. In the year 1374, the northern German city of Hamburg was home to 457 breweries. 457 in a city whose population likely did not exceed 15,000 people. At the same time, Munich, far to the south, had just 40. Hamburg's extraordinary brewing industry was built on a single ingredient, a bitter cone-shaped flower from a climbing plant that was quietly transforming the way beer was made across all of Europe. That ingredient was hops, and its rise would prove to be the most important change in the entire history of beer. The earliest mention of hops in connection with brewing dates to the 9th century, when the head of a monastery in northern France mentioned them in a set of administrative notes. His reference was brief and matter-of-fact, suggesting that hops were already a familiar part of the brewhouse, not something new. But the use of hops in beer almost certainly goes back even further. Archaeological evidence of hop cultivation in Central Europe stretches to at least the 6th century, and some scholars believe the practice is older still. For hundreds of years, hops coexisted alongside the old herbal blends, slowly gaining ground as brewers discovered what made them so special. And what made hops special was not just their flavor, though the flavor was certainly welcome. Hops gave beer a clean, pleasant bitterness that balanced the sweetness of the grain, producing a more refreshing drink than the sometimes heavy herbal taste of the old blends. But it was the preservative power of hops that truly set them apart. Beer brewed with hops lasted much longer without spoiling. While the old herbal beers might turn sour within days or weeks, hopped beer could remain drinkable for months, and heavily hopped beer could last even longer. This made it possible, for the first time, to brew beer in one place and ship it to distant markets without it going bad along the way. And that single fact changed everything. The great trading network of Northern Europe, a confederation of merchant cities stretching from the North Sea to the Baltic, recognized this commercial opportunity earlier and more clearly than anyone else. Hamburg, sitting on the river at the gateway to the sea lanes, became the undisputed beer capital of medieval Europe. Its breweries produced vast quantities of hopped beer for export, and beer became the city's most valuable commodity, generating more revenue than any other trade good. Merchants shipped beer in large oak barrels aboard broad-hulled ships, establishing trade routes and distribution networks that laid the groundwork for the global beer trade of later centuries. The success of this traded hopped beer put enormous pressure on regions that still relied on the old herbal blends. As drinkers in the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and the British Isles developed a taste for the more stable, more consistently flavored beer arriving from German ports, demand for the old-style brews declined. The bishops and lords who had profited handsomely from their monopoly on the herbal blends fought back, passing laws against hops and imposing heavy taxes on hopped beer. But the economic logic was impossible to resist. Hopped beer was simply a better product for trade. It lasted longer, traveled farther, tasted more consistent from batch to batch, and was cheaper to produce once a brewer had access to hops that did not require purchase from a monopoly supplier. One by one, the old monopolies crumbled. The spread of hop cultivation followed the spread of hopped beer itself. Monks in Bavaria were among the earliest to grow their own hops, tending hop gardens as far back as the 9th or 10th century. By the 1200s, hop fields were common across northern Germany and the Low Countries. By the 1300s, hops were being grown in England, though the English were notably slower to embrace them than their neighbours across the Channel. In fact, the English made a distinction in their language that lasted for centuries. The word ale meant a grain drink made without hops. The word beer meant a hopped drink. In some parts of England, hops were viewed with deep suspicion. One petition to the London City Council in the 1400s described hops as a wicked weed, and the English Crown tried to ban their use on several occasions, pushed by conservative brewers who saw hops as a foreign threat to their livelihood. But resistance was, in the end, pointless. By the 1500s, hops had conquered virtually every beer-drinking region in Europe, and the last significant holdouts of the old herbal brewing had vanished. The hop revolution did more than change what beer tasted like. It transformed the economics of the entire industry. Because hopped beer could be stored and shipped, it rewarded breweries that produced in larger quantities. Bigger operations with more equipment and more capital had an advantage over small home brewers. The shift to hops encouraged the growth of professional, commercial brewing and moved the industry further away from its ancient roots as a household craft. It shifted wealth from the feudal lords and churchmen who had controlled the herbal monopolies to the urban merchants and city governments who profited from the hop beer trade. And it established the basic recipe: water, grain, hops, and yeast. Though yeast was not understood for centuries to come, that still defines beer today. The hop plant itself is a quietly remarkable organism. It is a vigorous climbing vine, closely related to another well-known plant in its family, that can grow up to 6 meters in a single growing season, wrapping its rough stems around any support it can find. The papery cone-shaped flowers contain tiny glands that produce the bitter compounds and fragrant oils that brewers prize. Different varieties give different flavors, from the earthy, spicy character of traditional European types to the bold citrus and tropical fruit flavors of modern varieties bred in the Americas. The science of hop chemistry is now one of the most active areas of modern brewing research, but the fundamental discovery that this particular bitter flower could turn beer from a fragile local product into a stable, tradable commodity was made by nameless medieval brewers whose innovation quietly changed the course of history. And speaking of nameless contributions, let us turn now to another group whose role in the story of beer has been largely forgotten: the women who, for most of human history, were the ones doing the brewing. Walk into a medieval English village on a warm afternoon, and you might notice something peculiar hanging from the front of a certain cottage: a broom handle, or perhaps a bundle of twigs, poking out from the doorway like a crooked finger beckoning passers-by. This was the sign that fresh ale was available for sale, and the cottage belonged to an alewife, a woman who brewed beer in her home and sold the extra to her neighbors. She might also be wearing a tall, pointed hat, a common head covering for women of the period that helped her stand out above the crowds on market day. Inside her house, a large pot bubbled over the fire, sending clouds of fragrant steam through the room as a grain mixture slowly transformed into ale. A cat or two prowled nearby, keeping the mice that loved stored grain at bay. If that scene sounds familiar, there is a reason. The pointed hat, the bubbling cauldron, the broomstick by the door, the cat. These are the classic images of the witch. And their origins, some historians argue, lie not in the world of magic, but in the world of beer. For most of human history, brewing was women's work. We have seen this pattern again and again in our story. In Sumer, the goddess of beer was female and the brewers were women. In Egypt, tomb paintings show women grinding grain and straining the fermenting mash. In the Inca Empire, it was specially chosen women who prepared the sacred corn beer. In sub-Saharan Africa, the traditional brewers of sorghum beer were, and in many places still are, women. In Western Finland, women were the master brewers of the old juniper ale. Across cultures and continents, the pattern holds with remarkable consistency. In medieval Europe, brewing was considered a natural part of food preparation, which was the responsibility of women. The English word brewster, meaning a female brewer, was the standard term for someone who made ale, just as other English words for trades like baxter for a female baker and spinster for a female spinner reflected the fact that these were women's crafts. Every wife and mother was expected to know how to brew, in the same way she was expected to know how to bake bread and preserve food. Women who made especially good ale could sell the surplus, and those with enough resources and ambition could set up small alehouses that became important gathering places in their communities. The economic importance of these women was considerable. In an age when most professions were closed to women, brewing offered a rare path to independence. An alewife could earn her own money, build up property, manage a business, and exercise a degree of social influence that would have been impossible in almost any other line of work open to her. One historian studying court records, tax rolls, and account books from medieval England documented thousands of women who brewed and sold ale, reconstructing the economic lives of people who left almost no other trace in the written record. In some communities, the majority of all ale sold was produced by women working in their own homes. The laws of the time treated these brewing women with a mixture of regulation and grudging acceptance. Alewives appeared regularly before local courts, paying small fines for minor violations of the rules governing ale quality and pricing. These fines, often modest and paid routinely, worked less as punishments and more as a kind of licensing fee, an informal tax on the privilege of brewing and selling commercially. Some women brewed only when they needed a little extra income. Others were essentially full-time professionals, appearing in the records year after year, steadily building their trade. But then, slowly over the course of several centuries, everything changed. The adoption of hops, which we explored in the previous section, played a key role. Because hopped beer lasted longer and could be sold over greater distances, it favored larger brewing operations that required significant investment in equipment and storage. Women, who typically ran small operations out of their own kitchens, found it harder to compete. The rising cost of entering the commercial brewing world further disadvantaged them, since women had less access to credit, to capital, and to the professional networks that helped businesses grow. The rise of brewing guilds in the 1400s and 1500s made things worse. Guilds were overwhelmingly run by men, open to male apprentices, and built on the assumption that commercial activity was properly a man's domain. Many guild rules, whether stated openly or not, excluded women from membership. Some allowed widows to continue running their late husbands' breweries, but these exceptions only highlighted the general rule. Commercial brewing was being redefined as men's work, and the guild system enforced that definition with the force of law and custom. Alongside the economic displacement came a campaign of cultural mockery. Throughout medieval England, alewives were ridiculed as dishonest, immoral, and unfit for decent society. Carvings in churches show alewives being carried off to the underworld by demons, their ale cups still clutched in their hands, punished for the sins of watering down their product and charging too much. These images appeared most frequently in the very areas where competition between male and female brewers was fiercest, and they carried a clear message. Women who brewed and sold beer were sinful and deserving of punishment. The connection between alewives and the later stereotype of the witch is more complicated than popular stories often suggest. It is true that the pointed hat, The broomstick, the cauldron, and the cat all have connections to the world of the medieval brewing woman. But the witch stereotype as we know it today came together somewhat later, drawing on many different sources. What is clear, however, is that the systematic mocking and demonizing of female brewers served the interests of the men who were taking over their trade. By painting alewives as dishonest or even dangerous, the emerging male brewing establishment helped justify the exclusion of women from an industry they had created. The displacement was remarkably thorough. By the 1700s, commercial brewing in Europe was almost entirely a male profession, and it would remain so for over 2 centuries. The erasure was so complete that many people today are surprised to learn that brewing was ever women's work at all. The goddesses of beer were female. The first brewers in nearly every culture on Earth were female. But by the time the industrial age transformed brewing into a factory business, women had been almost entirely pushed out. In recent years, the modern craft beer movement has begun to address this long silence. Organizations dedicated to empowering women in the beer industry have been founded, and female brewers, once a rarity, are increasingly visible in breweries around the world. But the numbers remain small relative to the industry as a whole, and the imbalance remains one of the most enduring legacies of a displacement that began nearly 7 centuries ago. Let us move on now to a story of rules and regulations and a law that has shaped the idea of what beer should be for 500 years. On the 23rd of April 1516, in the Bavarian city of Ingolstadt, 2 brothers sat down to reshape the future of beer. Duke Wilhelm IV and Duke Ludwig X of Bavaria, co-rulers of the duchy, were presiding over a gathering of the nobles, clergy, and common people who governed the region's affairs. Among the many orders they issued that day was a brief decree that would become the most famous piece of food law in history. From this day forward, they declared, nothing but barley, hops, and water was to be used in the brewing of beer throughout Bavaria. No wheat, no rye, no oats, no spices, no herbs, no fruit, no honey, and certainly none of the dubious substances that some dishonest brewers had been known to add, things meant to increase the intoxication or cover up the taste of a spoiled batch. Just 3 ingredients and nothing more. This was the law that would come to be known as the German Beer Purity Law, and it would shape the identity of German brewing for the next 500 years. The famous name for this law was not actually used in 1516. The Duke's decree was simply one regulation among many. The catchy title was invented much later, in 1918, by a Bavarian politician during a debate over whether Bavaria should keep its own food rules after joining the new German Republic. Giving the old law a memorable name was a stroke of brilliance. It transformed a routine piece of 16th century commercial regulation into a national symbol, something that could be waved like a flag whenever German beer needed defending. The reasons behind the original decree were not purely about beer quality, though that was certainly part of it. Restricting brewing to barley served a critical economic purpose. It preserved the supply of wheat and rye for baking bread. Bavaria in the early 1500s was an agricultural society where bread was the most important food of ordinary people. Any competition between bakers and brewers for wheat and rye could drive up food prices to dangerous levels. By reserving those grains for the bakeries and allowing only barley in the brewhouse, the dukes ensured a stable bread supply while also pushing brewers toward the grain best suited to their craft. There was also a self-serving side to the law. The Bavarian ducal family held a monopoly on the production of wheat beer. By forbidding other brewers from using wheat, the dukes eliminated their competition while appearing to act in the public interest. It was a clever bit of politics wrapped in the language of consumer protection. The requirement that brewers use hops and only hops was equally important. By 1516, the battle between hops and the old herbal blends was essentially over in Bavaria, but the law made sure it stayed over. It also shut down any possibility of brewers adding dangerous plants that had sometimes found their way into medieval beer, substances that could produce hallucinations, headaches, or worse. The purity law put an end to all of that by insisting that the only permitted flavoring was hops. The law said nothing about yeast for the simple reason that nobody in 1516 understood what yeast was. The invisible organisms that turned sugar into alcohol were as mysterious to these Bavarian brewers as they had been to the people who first discovered fermentation 13,000 years earlier. Brewers knew from experience that storing their beer in cool caves produced a smoother, more stable drink, but they attributed this to the temperature alone, not to the different types of yeast that thrived in cold versus warm conditions. It would take another 3.5 centuries before science would reveal the truth. The law was eventually updated to include yeast as a fourth official ingredient, but the original text makes no mention of it. For centuries, the purity law applied only within Bavaria. Other German states had their own rules, some more relaxed, some just as strict. Northern Germany, in particular, had long traditions of brewing with wheat, spices, and other ingredients that the Bavarian law forbade. It was not until German unification in 1871 that the question of a single national brewing standard came up, and even then, the debate was fierce. Bavaria's entry into the newly unified Germany was conditional on certain concessions, and the preservation of its beer laws was among the points most stubbornly negotiated. The purity law was extended to all of Germany in 1906, though enforcement was uneven, and regional traditions that predated the law continued under various exceptions. The purity law became a powerful symbol of German brewing identity. German breweries stamped their labels with claims of adherence to the law, marketing it as proof of their commitment to quality and tradition. German beer drinkers took pride in a regulation they were told was the oldest food safety law still in effect, a claim that is debatable but undeniably good marketing. When a European court ruled in 1987 that Germany could not use its purity law to block the import of beers from other countries, the decision was treated in Germany as a national insult. Germany was forced to allow foreign beers that did not comply with its rules, but German brewers largely continued to follow the law by choice, and German consumers overwhelmingly continued to prefer beers brewed according to its requirements. In more recent times, the purity law has become a subject of lively debate. Supporters say it ensures quality, prevents the use of cheap substitutes, and preserves a tradition of genuine historical importance. Critics argue that it holds German brewers back, preventing them from competing with the creative and diverse craft beer movements flourishing in other countries. Belgian brewers who use spices, fruit, sugar, and all manner of unconventional ingredients to make some of the most celebrated beers in the world tend to view the German law with a mix of amusement and sympathy. American craft brewers have pointed out that some of the most inventive beers of the modern era would be illegal to produce in Germany under a strict reading of the rules. Whatever side you take, the law remains one of the most influential pieces of food legislation ever written. It defined German beer for half a millennium, shaped the global expectation of what beer should be, and established the idea that governments have both the right and the responsibility to regulate what goes into the food and drink of their citizens. And now, let us step back from the world of laws and regulations and into the busy, noisy, wonderfully human world of the medieval alehouse, where beer was not just a drink, but the very center of daily life. In a household in 16th century Hamburg, the morning began not with coffee or tea. Those drinks had not yet reached Northern Europe, but with a mug of beer. The midday meal was accompanied by beer. The evening ended with beer. And in between, whenever thirst struck or a neighbor stopped by, there was more beer. This was not a peculiarity of Hamburg. It was the universal pattern of daily life across Northern Europe for centuries. In the medieval and early modern world, beer was consumed in quantities that seem almost impossible to believe by modern standards. In cities across Germany and the Netherlands during the 1500s, the average person, counting every man, woman, and child, drank roughly 250 liters of beer per year. That works out to about 3/4 of a liter every single day. In Hamburg, the numbers climbed even higher, reaching an estimated 700 liters per person per year by the 1600s, nearly 2 liters a day for every person in the city. Even in England, where ale was somewhat less central than on the continent, the average was well over 200 liters per person per year. Now, before you picture an entire civilization in a permanent state of drunkenness, it is worth understanding what kind of beer these people were drinking. Medieval Europeans made a sharp distinction between strong ale, a potent brew saved for special occasions and celebrations, and what they called small beer or table beer, a thin, low-alcohol drink with perhaps 1 or 2% alcohol by volume. It was this small beer that people drank at every meal and throughout the day. It was given to children, to nursing mothers, to the elderly, and to the sick. It was not really a recreational drink at all. It was more like a food, a source of calories, vitamins, and minerals in a diet that was otherwise quite limited. And there was another reason small beer was everywhere. The water was often not safe to drink. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval towns and cities, the local water supply was frequently contaminated with waste from humans, animals, tanneries, and dye works. Drinking untreated water could make you very ill, or worse. But the process of brewing beer involved boiling the water, which killed the germs responsible for diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Beer was, quite simply, safer than water. In a world that knew nothing about germs, people had learnt through long experience that those who drank beer stayed healthier than those who drank from the well. The regulation of beer was one of the most important tasks of medieval government. In England, a set of rules attributed to King Henry III and dating to around 1266 established a sophisticated system for controlling the price and quality of ale. The rules tied the cost of ale to the current price of grain, so that when grain was expensive, brewers could charge more, and when it was cheap, they had to lower their prices. This sliding scale was designed to protect ordinary people from being overcharged during times of scarcity, while ensuring that brewers could still make a living. Quality was enforced by specially appointed officials known as ale tasters, men sworn to examine and judge the beer produced in their area. An ale taster was supposed to be a person of good character, sober habits, and a keen palate. A brewer found to have made bad beer or to have used short measures could be fined. Persistent offenders faced the public embarrassment of being strapped into a wooden seat and dunked into the nearest pond or river, a punishment that combined humiliation with a thorough soaking. The alehouse was the heart of medieval social life. It was the place where the life of the community happened. Alehouses were usually informal establishments, often just extensions of private homes, run by women who brewed on the premises and served customers in their front rooms or gardens. Unlike the more formal taverns which served wine to a wealthier crowd, or the inns which offered beds and meals to travelers, alehouses were for the ordinary people of the village. They came to drink, of course, but also to gossip, to do business, to settle arguments, to exchange news, to arrange marriages, to play games of dice and backgammon, to listen to traveling musicians, and to maintain the bonds that held their small world together. For many villagers, the alehouse was the only public space available, the one place where they could step outside the walls of their own home and join the wider life of the community. The brewing guilds that arose in the 1400s and 1500s brought a new layer of order and control to this previously loose arrangement. Guilds set standards for ingredients and methods, regulated the training of apprentices, controlled how many brewers could operate in a given area, and lobbied the authorities for rules that favored their members and limited outside competition. In Germany, the brewing guilds were especially powerful, and their influence can be seen in the increasingly detailed regulations that governed every step of the brewing process. The guilds also played a central role in pushing women out of the trade. restricting membership to men and imposing barriers that made it increasingly difficult for women to brew commercially. Beer served as a form of payment in many parts of the medieval world. In communities where coins were scarce and bartering was the normal way of doing business, beer was a reliable medium of exchange. Workers were frequently paid in beer rather than money, a practice that continued in some industries well into the 1800s. Monks, castle servants, hospital patients, household staff, and soldiers all received daily beer rations as part of their compensation. The amount varied according to rank, with higher status individuals receiving more and better beer, mirroring the broader social order. A reduction in the beer ration was taken as seriously as a pay cut, and disputes over beer allowances appear frequently in the labor records of medieval institutions. The medieval relationship with beer was in many ways more intimate than our relationship with any single drink today. Beer was food, drink, medicine, currency, and social glue, all at once. It was consumed from sunrise to sunset by rich and poor alike, at home and in public, during work and during rest. The idea that beer was optional or something to be enjoyed only at certain appropriate times would have been incomprehensible to a medieval European for whom it was as necessary and as unremarkable as the air. The entire structure of life in Northern Europe, its labor systems, its religious practices, its social networks, its economy was built, to a degree we often forget, on a foundation of fermented grain. And now, let us cross the English Channel and explore the distinctive beer culture that grew up on the islands of Britain, a story of ales, pubs, and a drink that traveled all the way to India. On a winter evening in 1722, in a cramped, smoky tavern somewhere in the tangled streets of East London, a porter set down his heavy load and called for his usual drink, a mixture of 3 different ales drawn from 3 separate barrels behind the bar and blended together in a single glass. This awkward 3-way blend was popular among the porters, dockworkers, and street vendors of London, but it was slow to pour, wasteful, and never quite the same twice. A brewer named Ralph Harwood, seeing a chance to simplify things, decided to replicate that blend in a single beer, a dark, well-hopped, full-bodied ale brewed in one batch and served from one barrel. The drink was an immediate success, and the workers who loved it gave it its name. They called it porter, and with that, London gave the world its first beer style designed specifically for large-scale production and global distribution. Porter was a revolution in the business of brewing. Within decades, London's porter breweries had grown into some of the largest industrial enterprises of their age, rivaling textile mills in the scale of their operations. These breweries were among the first in England to use steam engines to power their machinery. Their wooden storage vats were enormous, some holding more than 4,000 barrels. By the end of the 1700s, porter was being brewed not only in London but also in Dublin, where a young brewer named Arthur Guinness had set up shop and would eventually develop the dry, roasty style that became the most famous Irish beer in the world. Porter traveled across the Atlantic to North America, across the sea to Russia and Scandinavia, and even to the Caribbean, establishing the first truly international market for a single style of beer. But porter was only one thread in the rich fabric of British beer culture. The development of pale ale was equally important. The key advance was a change in how malt was made. For centuries, English malt had been dried over wood or coal fires that filled it with smoke and darkened it considerably. When a cleaner burning fuel came into use for the kilns, the malt that emerged was much lighter in color, and the beer brewed from it was a pale golden ale with a flavor quite different from the dark porters and stouts that had dominated for so long. A town in the English Midlands called Burton-upon-Trent proved to be the perfect place for this new style. The local water was unusually rich in minerals, which gave the beer a crisp, clean bitterness and a dry finish that became the signature of the pale ales brewed there. And then there is the story of India Pale Ale, a tale that has been wrapped in so many layers of myth and marketing that the truth is hard to find beneath it all. The popular version says that a London brewer deliberately created a heavily hopped, high-strength pale ale designed to survive the 6-month sea voyage to India, where British colonists were desperate for a taste of home. The reality is less dramatic but more interesting. Beers of various styles, including porter, had been shipped to India for years. What this particular brewer did was take advantage of his location near the shipping docks, making it convenient for captains to pick up barrels of his pale ale as they left London. He also offered generous payment terms that matched the length of the round trip. The beer traveled well, thanks to the preservative effect of all those hops, and the brewer built a near monopoly on the India trade. But the idea that the style was specifically invented for the voyage is mostly a later invention of the storytellers. British beer culture was shaped not only by what was brewed, but by where it was drunk. The pub, short for public house, has been the heart of social life in Britain for centuries. It was a democratic space, a place where people of different backgrounds could sit side by side and share a drink. The architecture of the pub evolved over the years into something distinctive, with its cozy back rooms, its dartboards and dominoes, its open fires and polished wood, its etched glass and brass fittings. One famous writer, imagining his ideal pub, described it in loving detail, a place that was simultaneously a living room, a parliament, and a confessional. The pub was, and in many places still is, the living room of the community. For over a century, many British pubs were owned by breweries and required to sell only that brewery's products. This system ensured a reliable market for each brewery but limited what drinkers could choose. When reforms in the late 1980s required the largest breweries to sell off many of their pubs, the result, somewhat unexpectedly, helped open the door for smaller independent breweries to reach new customers, laying the groundwork for the craft beer movement that would follow. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of British beer culture, and the one most often misunderstood by visitors, was its preference for cask-conditioned ales served at cellar temperature, rather than the ice-cold, fizzy lagers that dominated elsewhere. This ale undergoes a second fermentation right in the barrel from which it is served, producing a softer, gentler fizz than the forced carbonation used in most modern beers. The result is a living drink that changes subtly from day to day and must be served within a few days of being opened. Foreign visitors sometimes described it, a bit uncharitably, as warm and flat. But for the British, it was not a flaw. It was a point of pride, a mark of quality and tradition that set their beer apart from the mass-produced drinks flooding the world. And now, let us cross the water once more, this time to a small country that has produced a diversity of beer styles unmatched by any other nation on earth. On a cool autumn evening in the countryside southwest of Brussels, inside a centuries-old brewhouse with whitewashed walls and a clay tile roof, a brewer opens the shuttered windows of a large, shallow copper vessel. The night air rushes in, carrying with it a cargo invisible to the eye, wild yeasts and tiny organisms native to the valley, microbes that have lived in this landscape for centuries. There is no carefully cultivated yeast added by hand. The brewer simply opens the window and waits for nature to do its work. By morning, the wildlife in the air will have settled into the warm liquid, beginning a slow, unpredictable fermentation that will continue for 1 to 3 years in old oak barrels. The result will be one of the most unusual and ancient beer styles in the Western world. A living link to the days before science, before industry, before anyone understood what fermentation really was. This is Belgium, a country smaller than the American state of Maryland, with a population of barely 11 million. And yet, it produces a diversity of beer styles that no other nation on earth can match. Nearly 1,500 distinct types of beer are brewed within its borders, spanning a range of methods, flavors, and traditions that defies easy classification. Where Germany prizes purity and consistency, and Britain favors a handful of well-defined styles perfected over centuries, Belgium celebrates variety, individuality, and creative daring. Belgian beer is not a single tradition. It is a kaleidoscope of traditions, each rooted in the history, geography, and culture of a particular region, monastery, town, or family. The Trappist tradition represents the high point of Belgian monastic brewing and one of its most carefully guarded names. Beginning in the 1200s, monks at monasteries in what is now Belgium began brewing beer for their own use, selling the extra to their neighbors. This practice was nearly destroyed during the upheavals that followed the French Revolution, when religious houses across the region were shut down and their property taken. But after Belgium gained its independence in 1830, the monasteries reopened and their brewing traditions were revived with fresh energy, producing ales of remarkable quality that eventually gained admirers around the world. Today, there are 6 Trappist breweries in Belgium. For a beer to carry the special Trappist label, it must be brewed within the walls of a monastery. The monks must play a genuine role in making it, and the profits must support the monastery and its charitable works. One of these monasteries, tucked away in the countryside of West Flanders, produces a beer frequently described by experts as one of the greatest in the world. Yet it is made in tiny quantities and sold only at the monastery gate, with strict limits on how much each visitor may buy. The Belgian tradition of strong abbey ales extends well beyond the Trappist monasteries. The familiar terms for these beers, words that roughly translate as double, triple, and quadruple, originated at one of the Trappist monasteries in the early 20th century and have since become broad stylistic categories used by breweries across the country and imitated around the world. The double is dark and malt-forward with flavors of dried fruit and toasted bread. The triple is golden, strong, and effervescent with a complex blend of fruity and spicy flavors. The quadruple is the strongest and most intense, a rich, warming drink that can develop remarkable depth with age. Then there is the story of Belgian white beer, a pale, hazy wheat beer flavored with coriander and dried orange peel, a recipe that recalls the spiced beers brewed before hops took over. This style was once common across the region, but by the middle of the 20th century, it had been swept away by the tide of industrial lager. The last brewery that made it closed in 1957. The style was rescued by a single person, a milkman from the village where the old brewery had stood, who remembered the beer from his youth. In 1966, he opened a small brewery and began making white beer again, using a recipe he had pieced together from local memory and old notes. The beer was an immediate success, and it sparked a revival of interest in traditional Belgian styles that continues to this day. It is a reminder of how fragile a brewing tradition can be and how much can depend on the determination of one person willing to invest their savings in something the world has given up on. The wild beer of the valley near Brussels is perhaps the most remarkable of all Belgian traditions. It is the only major beer style in the Western world that relies entirely on spontaneous fermentation. The very same process that produced the first beers in prehistoric caves thousands of years ago. The wild yeasts and bacteria that settle into the cooling liquid contribute flavors that develop over months and years of aging in old barrels, producing a beer of extraordinary complexity. A sparkling blend of young and old vintages of this wild beer, sometimes called the champagne of beers, is one of the most elegant drinks in the brewing world. A version made with whole sour cherries is one of the most delicious fruit beers ever created, and a sweetened version was once the everyday drink of workers in Brussels. In 2016, an international body recognized Belgian beer culture as part of the intangible heritage of humanity. The recognition honored not just the beer itself, but the entire world that surrounds it. The breweries and cafes, the distinctive glassware designed for each specific beer, the traditions of pairing beer with food, and the social rituals of Belgian drinking. It was a fitting tribute to a small country that has preserved against all the pressures of global consolidation, a depth and diversity of brewing tradition unmatched anywhere on Earth. And now let us leave Belgium and travel east to the heart of Bohemia, where a single batch of beer, brewed on an autumn day in 1842, was about to change the way the entire world drinks. In 1838, in the Bohemian city of Plzeň, a group of angry citizens gathered in the town square and made a dramatic public statement about their local beer. They rolled 36 barrels of freshly brewed ale into the street and poured every last drop into the gutters, declaring the beer unfit to drink. This act of civic protest, driven by years of frustration with sour, inconsistent local ales, set in motion a chain of events that would produce the most influential beer style in human history, a style that today accounts for the vast majority of all beer brewed and consumed on Earth. The people of Plzeň were not against beer. They were against bad beer. Their city had held the right to brew since the late 1200s, and that right was a source of great civic pride. But by the 1830s, the quality had slipped badly. Ales brewed at warm temperatures with unpredictable wild yeast were notoriously hit or miss, and the hot Bohemian summers only made things worse. Sour, spoiled batches were common. Meanwhile, just across the border in Bavaria, brewers were producing clean, consistent lagers that made the ales of Plzeň look shabby by comparison. Something had to change. The solution was bold. The citizens decided to build a brand new brewery from the ground up, equipped with the best available technology, and to hire the finest brewer they could find. More than 260 local citizens pooled their money to fund the project. Deep cellars were carved from the sandstone beneath the building to provide the cold temperatures needed for lager production. And for their master brewer, they looked south to Bavaria and hired a 29-year-old man named Josef Groll. Groll was, by all accounts, a difficult personality. Sharp-tongued and abrasive, his own father reportedly called him the rudest man in Bavaria. But he was a supremely skilled brewer, trained in the Bavarian art of cold fermentation. When Groll arrived in Plas in the early months of 1842, he brought with him the Bavarian knowledge of bottom fermentation, but he found himself working with ingredients unlike anything he had used in Munich. The water of Plzeň was remarkably soft, with almost no minerals, far softer than the hard water of Munich. This softness produced a delicate, rounded flavor. The local hops, grown in the nearby region of Western Bohemia, were among the finest in Europe, prized for their subtle, elegant, gently spicy aroma. And the pale malt available from the surrounding countryside, made with the latest techniques, was lighter in color than anything Groll was used to, yielding a brilliantly pale liquid that no one had ever seen in a beer before. On the 5th of October 1842, Groll brewed his first batch. He combined the pale malt, the local hops, the soft water, and Bavarian lager yeast in a combination that had never before been attempted. 5 weeks later, on the 11th of November, at the public celebrations in the town, the first barrel was tapped, and the crowd was astonished. The beer that poured out was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. It was golden, brilliantly clear, and sparkling with natural fizz, utterly different from the dark, cloudy ales and amber lagers that had dominated for centuries. The flavor was crisp and clean, refreshingly bitter, with a delicate floral aroma and a smooth, dry finish. It was, in a word, a revelation. And here is a lovely coincidence that made it even more dramatic. Glass drinking vessels, which had long been a luxury only the wealthy could afford, were just becoming available to ordinary people at the very moment the golden beer appeared. For centuries, beer had been served in opaque ceramic mugs or metal cups that hid its appearance. Now, for the first time, people could see their beer, and what they saw was a luminous honey gold liquid that sparkled and gleamed in the light. The visual beauty of this new beer was as important as its taste. It was the first beer that looked as good as it tasted. The new beer spread rapidly, carried by the expanding railroad networks that were connecting the cities of Central Europe. By the 1850s, it was being exported to Vienna, Paris, and beyond, where it was received with enthusiasm by drinkers accustomed to darker, heavier beers. The word Pilsner soon became a general term for any pale golden lager, a development that the original brewery fought against but could not control. Breweries across Europe and eventually around the world began producing their own versions, often with significant departures from the original recipe. The Czech beer culture that nurtured Pilsner has its own distinctive character. The neighborhood pub in the Czech lands is a plain, no-frills place where good conversation and the quality of the beer are what matter most. The Czech people consistently top the global charts for beer consumption, drinking roughly 130 to 140 liters per person per year, a figure that exceeds even Germany's. The tradition of serving fresh, unpasteurized beer delivered directly from brewery tanks to nearby pubs produces some of the freshest and most flavorful lager available anywhere in the world. Josef Groll's contract with the Citizens Brewery lasted only 3 years. He returned to Bavaria in 1845, reportedly unhappy with his time in Bohemia despite the enormous success of what he had made. He felt underappreciated and underpaid. He died in his hometown in 1887, having played no further significant role in the brewing world. But the beer he created on that October day in 1842 went on to become the most widely consumed style on earth. Today, the vast majority of all beer produced and drunk around the world, from the largest global brands to local lagers on every continent, is some variation of the golden drink that a difficult young Bavarian brewed in a Bohemian basement nearly 2 centuries ago. His temperament is forgotten, but his beer is immortal. And now, let us step back and explore the science that made lager possible, a story of cold caves, winter ice, and a mysterious yeast that traveled halfway around the world. Beneath the rolling hills of southern Bavaria, in a darkness so complete that a candle flame would dance in the cold, still air, thousands of barrels of beer sat waiting. For centuries, Bavarian brewers had carved deep cellars into the hillsides and filled them with blocks of ice harvested from frozen lakes during the winter. These underground cold rooms kept the beer at temperatures just above freezing for weeks, sometimes months, while something quiet and remarkable happened inside each barrel. The beer became smoother, clearer, and more refined, losing the harsh, yeasty flavors that often troubled ales made at warmer temperatures. The brewers did not understand why cold storage worked so well. They only knew that it did. And to protect these precious cellars from the summer heat, they planted chestnut trees above them, choosing the species deliberately for its wide-spreading canopy, which provided dense shade without sending deep roots down into the caverns below. On warm afternoons, people from the surrounding villages would gather beneath those chestnut trees to drink the cool beer stored underneath. This simple, pleasant custom, sitting under a tree and drinking lager from the cellar below, grew over time into one of the most beloved institutions in German culture, the outdoor beer garden. The Bavarian practice of cold brewing was enforced by law long before anyone understood the science behind it. In 1553, a Bavarian duke issued a regulation forbidding the brewing of beer during the warm months, from late April through the end of September. This summer brewing ban was driven by the simple observation that beer made during hot weather was far more likely to spoil or turn sour. The ban effectively restricted brewing to the cooler half of the year and ensured that beer drunk during summer had been made during winter and stored in the icy cellars through the spring. Without anyone intending it, this rule also favored the survival and spread of a special kind of yeast that thrived in cold conditions, a yeast that would eventually change the course of beer history. The beer that came out of those Bavarian caves was different from anything produced by traditional warm fermentation. It was cleaner, more predictable, and had a subtle, balanced flavor that made it remarkably easy to drink. Where ales fermented at warm temperatures tend to produce bold, fruity flavors, the cold fermented beer was quieter, letting the character of the grain, the hops and the water come through without distraction. But for centuries, nobody understood why. The answer lay in a tiny organism that would not be properly identified until the late 1800s. This was a hybrid yeast, a fusion of two different species, one of which thrived in warmth and one of which preferred the cold. The cold-loving half of this partnership remained a mystery for a very long time. Then, in 2011, a team of researchers made a surprising discovery. They found the missing parent species not in Europe, but in the beech forests of Patagonia, at the southern tip of South America. This cold-tolerant yeast, native to the frigid conditions of the far south, turned out to be almost genetically identical to the mysterious half of the lager yeast. How a yeast from Patagonia ended up in Bavarian cellars is still debated. It may have been carried across the ocean on the hulls of ships, in the soil clinging to imported plants, or even in the guts of insects that hitched a ride on cargo during the Age of Exploration. However it arrived, it found in those dark, cold Bavarian caves the perfect home. Two men, born a year apart and trained in the same Bavarian tradition, did more than anyone else to turn lager from a local Bavarian specialty into a drink the whole world would want. The first took over his family's brewery in Munich at the age of just 15. The second came from a brewing family near Vienna. They met in 1832 and formed a friendship that would reshape the beer world. Together, they set off on a long tour of breweries across Europe, visiting Belgium, Germany, Scotland, and England, studying the most advanced techniques of the day. Their methods were not always polite. They reportedly smuggled thermometers inside their walking sticks and secretly collected samples of fermenting beer in hollowed-out canes. They were, in essence, industrial spies on a continental scale. But the knowledge they brought home, particularly about English methods of making lighter-colored malt, proved transformative. In 1841, the brewer from Vienna used what he had learned to create a new kind of malt, gently heated to produce a warm amber color, and from it he brewed the first Vienna lager, a reddish amber beer of remarkable smoothness and elegance. That same year, his friend in Munich introduced a similar innovation, producing a rich amber lager brewed at extra strength in March for drinking in the autumn, a style that would eventually become the official beer of the Great Munich Festival known around the world. Both beers were made using cold fermentation and the ancient storage techniques refined over centuries in Bavarian caves. They proved, for the first time, that lager could be something more than a rough local drink. It could be refined, sophisticated, and worthy of the finest tables. But there was still a problem. Lager needed cold, and cold was hard to come by. Brewing was limited to the cooler months. The enormous quantities of ice needed for summer storage were expensive, unreliable, and increasingly hard to obtain as cities grew and industrial pollution compromised natural water sources. The Munich brewer himself helped solve this problem when he persuaded a young engineering professor to install one of his experimental mechanical cooling devices in the brewery's cellars. This partnership between brewer and engineer, between the needs of the market and the possibilities of technology, would set the stage for the most dramatic transformation in the history of beer. The Bavarian lagering tradition, born in underground caves and sustained by winter ice, had created a type of beer so appealing in its clarity, consistency, and clean taste that brewers everywhere wanted to make it. But without reliable cold, lager remained tied to certain places and certain seasons. The arrival of mechanical refrigeration was about to change all of that, setting lager free from the limits of geography and climate and sending it on a path toward world domination that continues to this day. And so we move forward to the moment when science finally caught up with the ancient art of brewing, and when the invisible creatures that had been doing the real work for thousands of years were seen and understood at last. In the autumn of 1871, a French scientist sat in a makeshift laboratory, hunched over a microscope, examining a drop of cloudy beer. France had just suffered a humiliating defeat in war against Germany, and this man, a fierce patriot, channeled his anger into an unlikely ambition. He would make French beer better than German beer. The Germans, with their precise methods and their scientific approach, had come to dominate European brewing, and he took this as a personal challenge. If he could unlock the secrets of fermentation, France could produce beer to rival anything from Bavaria. His name was Louis Pasteur, and his study of beer would change not just brewing, but the entire course of science. Pasteur had already spent more than a decade proving something that now seems obvious, but was deeply controversial at the time: fermentation. The process that turned sugary liquid into alcohol was not simply a chemical reaction, as many leading scientists insisted. It was a living process, driven by tiny organisms too small to see with the naked eye. Yeast was not a byproduct of fermentation. It was the cause. This single insight, arrived at through years of careful experiment, overturned centuries of misunderstanding and laid the groundwork for what would become the germ theory of disease, one of the most important ideas in all of science. But Pasteur did not stop there. He showed that the souring and spoiling of beer, wine, and milk were caused by the invasion of specific unwanted organisms, each producing its own particular off-flavors. And he demonstrated that these invaders could be killed by gentle heating, a technique that would come to bear his name. He showed that brewers who kept their equipment scrupulously clean, who excluded unwanted organisms, and who controlled the temperature of their beer could produce a good, consistent product, batch after batch, year after year. His book on the subject, published in 1876, gave brewers something they had never had before: a scientific explanation for why beer sometimes went bad, and practical advice for preventing it. But Pasteur, for all his brilliance, missed something important. He focused almost entirely on bacteria as the source of beer problems. He did not fully realize that yeast itself, the very organism that made fermentation possible, could also be a source of trouble, that contamination by wild or unwanted strains of yeast could produce flavors just as bad as anything caused by bacteria. That gap would be filled by a quiet, meticulous scientist working in a laboratory in Copenhagen. His name was Emil Christian Hansen, and he arrived at the research laboratory of a Danish brewery in 1879. The brewery's founder was an unusual man, a visionary who had traveled to Munich decades earlier to obtain a sample of Bavarian lager yeast and had carried it all the way back to Denmark in a tin can, keeping it alive by pouring cold water over it from streams along the way. This founder had established his laboratory with a remarkably generous mission to advance the science of brewing for the benefit of the entire industry, not just his own company. It was the first dedicated brewing research laboratory in the world. Hansen threw himself into the work. The brewery had been having persistent quality problems, batches that developed strange, harsh flavors that ruined the clean profile of the lager. Hansen began examining the yeast used in the brewery under powerful microscopes, and what he found was a revelation. The yeast was not a single organism. It was a mixture of several different strains, some desirable and some decidedly not. The bad flavors were being caused not by bacteria, as Pasteur would have predicted, but by wild yeast strains that had crept into the brewery's cultures over time. Hansen's solution was elegant and painstaking. Working with extraordinary patience, he developed a method for isolating a single yeast cell from a mixed culture and growing it, through careful steps, into a pure culture containing only one genetically uniform strain. In November of 1883, after months of delicate work, he brewed the first batch of beer using a pure culture of a single yeast strain. The beer was perfect, clean, consistent, and free of every off flavor that had plagued previous batches. Hansen had achieved what no brewer in 10,000 years of history had accomplished: complete control over the organism that makes beer. And then he did something even more remarkable. He gave his discovery away. At the insistence of the brewery's founder, and in keeping with the laboratory's mission of advancing knowledge for everyone, Hansen shared his pure yeast culture and his isolation technique freely, openly and without charge with any brewery that asked. Within a few years, his method had been adopted by breweries across Europe, transforming the entire industry. The yeast strain he had isolated was later named in honor of both the laboratory where it was discovered and the French scientist whose foundational work had made Hansen's breakthrough possible. Not everyone embraced the change. British ale brewers, proud of their centuries-old methods, viewed pure yeast cultures with deep suspicion. The complex, characterful flavors they prized in their ales, the fruitiness, the subtle spice, the depth that set a good English ale apart from a clean lager, were produced not by a single yeast strain, but by the messy interaction of multiple strains and even some wild organisms. To adopt pure cultures, they argued, would be to sacrifice the very qualities that made British beer worth drinking. Some traditional breweries continued to use mixed cultures well into the 20th century. The combined legacy of these two men, the French patriot and the Danish perfectionist, was nothing less than the transformation of brewing from a craft into a science. Before their work, brewing was an art practiced by skilled hands guided by tradition and instinct. After their work, it became a discipline grounded in biology, chemistry, and engineering. The invisible brewer, the yeast cell, had been made visible, understood, and mastered, and the beer it produced would never be the same. Let us cross the Atlantic now, where a wave of German immigrants was about to transplant their love of lager to a new world and build an empire of beer. On a hot summer afternoon in 1860, in a neighborhood on the south side of St. Louis, the air was thick with the sweet, malty smell of boiling grain. The streets were lined with houses where German was spoken more often than English, where the local shops sold sausages and sauerkraut, and where the corner tavern poured foaming glasses of lager beer that tasted, to homesick immigrants, almost exactly like the beer they had left behind in Bavaria. A small, struggling brewery in this neighborhood was about to be taken over by a young German immigrant, a man whose combination of vision, energy, and fierce commercial ambition would reshape the American beer industry from top to bottom. His name was Adolphus Busch, and he had come to America at the age of 18, one of 21 children from a prosperous family in the Rhineland. The story of Busch and his brewery is inseparable from the larger story of German immigration to America, one of the great migrations of the 19th century. Between 1840 and 1890, roughly 5 million Germans crossed the Atlantic, driven by failed revolutions, economic hardship, and the promise of opportunity. They brought with them their language, their customs, their music, and their beer. In the cities where they settled most thickly, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Chicago, and New York, German immigrants immediately set about building breweries to satisfy their thirst for lager. The numbers are staggering. In 1810, there were roughly 130 breweries in the entire United States. By the mid-1870s, there were about 4,000, the vast majority German-owned or German-run. Milwaukee alone, a city where more than 40% of the population had been born in Germany, was home to dozens of them. What made this boom so transformative was not just the number of breweries, but the ambition of the people who ran them. Busch was among the first American brewers to read and act upon the scientific discoveries coming out of European laboratories. He introduced bottled, heat-treated beer to the American market, a crucial step that allowed beer to be shipped long distances without spoiling. He invested heavily in the new mechanical cooling technology, building a network of refrigerated warehouses and cold rail cars that kept his beer chilled from the brewery to the customer, no matter the season or the distance. He used the telegraph and the expanding railroad to coordinate a distribution system of unprecedented reach. And he was one of the first brewers to grasp the power of brand marketing, investing in advertising and cultivating the image of his flagship beer as a premium product. Busch was not alone in his ambitions. In Milwaukee, another German immigrant had married into a brewing family and was building what would briefly become the largest brewery in America. His decision to tie a blue silk ribbon around the neck of each bottle led to a name that would endure for over a century. Another Milwaukee brewer adopted the slogan that his beer was the one that had made the city famous. And yet another, born in a small town in southern Germany, purchased a brewery on the outskirts of Milwaukee in 1855 and began the operation that would grow into one of the great names in American beer. In each case, the pattern was the same: a German immigrant with brewing knowledge and commercial energy, seizing the opportunity of a vast and growing market. The beer these German Americans brewed gradually became something different from the Bavarian lagers that had inspired it. American barley was not quite the same as European barley. It had more protein, which caused cloudiness, and less of the kind of starch that brewers preferred. To solve this problem, American brewers began adding other grains, principally corn and rice, to their recipes. These additions lightened the body and smoothed the flavor, producing a clearer, more neutral beer with broader appeal. This was not, as later critics would claim, purely a way to cut costs. It was a practical response to the characteristics of American ingredients, adapted to the tastes of a diverse population that included not just Germans but Irish, Italians, Poles, and many others. The beer gardens that sprang up in American cities during this period were as important culturally as the breweries themselves. Modeled on the outdoor drinking traditions of Bavaria, these were family-friendly places where immigrants and their neighbors gathered to drink lager, eat pretzels and sausages, listen to brass bands, play cards, and enjoy the open air. They stood in marked contrast to the rougher American saloon, which was often a male-only establishment associated with drunkenness and gambling. The beer garden offered a different vision entirely: beer as a social drink consumed in moderation by families, in daylight, accompanied by food and music and conversation. It was a model of civilized drinking that would soon come under fierce attack. The wave of hostility toward German culture that erupted during the First World War dealt a devastating blow to this community and its traditions. German-language newspapers were shut down. German was banned from schools. Familiar foods were given patriotic new names. And the brewing industry, so visibly German in its ownership and its culture, became a convenient target for the temperance movement, which had long sought to ban alcohol and now had a powerful new weapon in wartime patriotism. The breweries were portrayed as agents of a foreign enemy, their profits as money flowing into the hands of the enemy. The convergence of anti-alcohol campaigning and anti-German feeling proved unstoppable. Within a few years, the constitutional amendment banning alcohol had been ratified, and the great German-American brewing empires built over half a century were shut down overnight. The names that survived tell the story. The brands that still dominate the American beer market today were nearly all founded by German immigrants in the 19th century. The beer they make now is lighter and milder than anything a Bavarian brewer of the 1840s would recognize. But the basic principle, a cold fermented lager brewed with precision and an eye on the widest possible market, is a direct inheritance from the men who crossed the Atlantic with yeast in their luggage and the taste of home on their tongues. And now, let us look more closely at the technologies that made this national beer industry possible, the ice machines and the railroads that changed everything. In the summer of 1873, a brewer in Munich stood in the deep cellars beneath his brewery and watched as engineers installed a machine unlike anything the brewing world had ever seen. It was a hulking, clanking apparatus of iron pipes, copper coils, and pressurized chambers, built by a young professor from the local university. The machine used a circulating chemical to absorb heat from the cellar air and push it outside, producing a steady stream of cold without a single block of ice. If it worked, it would free the brewery from its ancient dependence on winter ice, the frozen blocks that had to be cut from lakes and rivers each year and packed underground to keep the beer cold through the summer. And the machine worked beautifully. Within weeks, the brewery's cellars were holding a steady, perfect temperature for lager all year round with no ice at all. The implications were enormous, not just for this one brewery, but for every brewery in the world. For centuries, lager production had been chained to the natural cycle of the seasons. Bavarian law had traditionally forbidden brewing during the warm months because hot weather made fermentation unpredictable and spoilage almost certain. Even after the law relaxed, the practical need for ice meant that lager remained a seasonal product brewed in the cold months and stored through the summer, with supplies dwindling as the heat of August melted away the last of the winter reserves. In a warm winter, ice harvests could fall short, leaving breweries scrambling. The new cooling machine changed all of that. For the first time in the 10,000-year history of brewing, a brewer could make lager year-round, regardless of what was happening outside. The young professor who built the machine quickly refined his design and began selling cooling units to breweries across Germany and beyond. The machines were large, expensive, and required skilled engineers to keep them running. But they offered a decisive advantage, and brewers were willing to pay. By 1890, the professor's company had sold more than 700 units, most of them to breweries and cold storage facilities. By the turn of the century, mechanical cooling had become essential equipment in every serious brewery in Europe. The technology crossed the Atlantic eagerly. American brewers, already shipping beer across thousands of miles by rail, recognized that year-round production and reliable cold from brewery to customer were the keys to dominating the national market. By the 1890s, mechanical refrigeration was standard in every major American brewery. But refrigeration was only half the story. The other technology that transformed brewing was the railroad. Before the railroad, beer was a local product by necessity. It was heavy, it spoiled quickly, and the cost of hauling barrels over rutted roads by horse-drawn wagon made long-distance shipping impractical. A single barrel weighed over 300 pounds and sold for just a few dollars. The math did not work beyond a radius of a few dozen miles. The expansion of the railroad network in the 1860s and 70s changed everything. Breweries located at major rail junctions could now ship their beer hundreds or even thousands of miles in days rather than weeks, reaching markets that had previously been served only by small local operations. Refrigerated rail cars made the system complete. These specially insulated cars, packed with ice at the top to keep their cargo cold, ensured that lager arrived at its destination fresh. The refrigerator car had originally been developed for the meat packing industry to ship beef from Chicago to the East Coast. But brewers adopted it with enthusiasm, and by the 1880s, thousands of cold cars were carrying beer across the American continent. One of the most ambitious brewers built an entire fleet of company-owned refrigerated cars and established a chain of ice stations along the rail routes where the cars could be topped up during the journey. The combination of mechanical cooling, railroad shipping, heat treatment, and glass bottling created a new kind of brewery, the National Shipping Brewery. These were massive industrial operations that produced beer not for a neighborhood or a city, but for an entire country. They used their advantages of scale, technology, and marketing to reach consumers everywhere, and the results were dramatic. In 1873, there were more than 4,000 breweries operating in the United States. By 1910, the number had fallen below 1,500. The national giants, with their lower costs and their relentless advertising, had systematically undercut and absorbed their smaller competitors. A national brand would enter a local market, offer its beer at a price the local brewery could not match, back it up with advertising the local brewery could not afford, and gradually squeeze the smaller operation out of business. It was the first great wave of consolidation in American beer, and it established a pattern that would repeat again and again throughout the 20th century. Mechanical refrigeration did more than change how beer was made and delivered. It changed what beer was. Lager, which had been a regional specialty of Bavaria and Bohemia, became the dominant style across Europe, North America, and eventually the entire world. The reason was straightforward. Ales could be made anywhere, with or without cooling equipment. But lager needed cold, constant cold, from the moment the yeast was added through weeks or months of aging. Only mechanical refrigeration could provide that cold reliably and affordably on an industrial scale. As refrigeration spread, so did lager, pushing aside ales and traditional brews in market after market until it achieved the global dominance it holds today, accounting for roughly 90% of all beer produced worldwide. The engineer who built that first machine died in Munich in 1934, at the age of 92, honored as one of the great inventors of his era. His cooling technology transformed not just brewing but the entire modern world, from food preservation to air conditioning. But it was beer that proved his concept, beer that made his fortune, and beer that provided the first and most eager market for his invention. And now, let us turn to a darker chapter, a time when the beer taps of an entire nation were shut off, and the world of American brewing was brought to its knees. On January the 16th, 1920, at the stroke of midnight, the United States of America went dry. The amendment to the Constitution that banned the making, importing, transporting, and selling of alcoholic drinks took effect, and an entire industry was snuffed out by law. In the final hours before midnight, crowds gathered at bars and restaurants for what the newspapers called the last call. In some cities, mock funerals were staged, with coffins paraded through the streets and mourners weeping in theatrical grief. At the stroke of 12, the taps were shut off, the barrels sealed, and the lights went out in thousands of saloons, taverns, beer gardens, and neighborhood bars. An industry that had been the fifth largest in America, one that employed hundreds of thousands of workers and contributed roughly 14% of all tax revenue, was gone. The roots of this great shutting down stretched back nearly a century. The temperance movement had begun in the 1820s and 30s as a genteel campaign for moderation, led by doctors, preachers, and reformers who were genuinely alarmed by the staggering rates of drinking in early America, rates roughly 3 times what they are today. Over the following decades, the movement evolved from a call for moderation into a militant crusade for total abstinence and legal prohibition. Its supporters came from an unlikely coalition. Evangelical Protestants viewed alcohol as a tool of evil. Progressive reformers saw the saloon as a breeding ground for corruption. Women fighting for the right to vote identified alcohol as the primary cause of domestic violence and family poverty. And some politicians used the anti-alcohol cause to target immigrant communities whose foreign customs they despised. 2 organizations proved devastatingly effective. One, founded in 1873, mobilized women. The other, founded 20 years later, perfected the art of single-issue political campaigning. This second group supported or opposed candidates at every level of government based solely on their position on alcohol, regardless of party, character, or any other issue. By 1916, they had helped elect enough sympathetic lawmakers to push the amendment through. The entry of the United States into the First World War in 1917 gave the movement its most powerful weapon. Anti-German feeling, already simmering, boiled over. The brewing industry, so visibly German in its ownership and its culture, became an easy target. The argument was simple and brutal. Every bushel of grain used for beer was a bushel denied to the troops. Every dollar spent on beer enriched families with suspected loyalty to the enemy. The combination of anti-alcohol crusading, wartime patriotism, and anti-German hostility proved unstoppable. The amendment banning alcohol was ratified in barely 13 months. The impact on the brewing industry was swift and devastating. Of the roughly 1,300 breweries operating before the ban, the vast majority closed permanently within months. Their equipment was dismantled, their recipes forgotten, their skilled workers scattered. A few of the largest survived by making other things. One major brewery produced a non-alcoholic grain drink, along with yeast, corn syrup, and soft drinks. Another made malted milk for candy makers, a product everyone understood was really meant for home brewing. The oldest brewery in America, founded in 1829, survived by making a legal near beer with almost no alcohol and by opening an ice cream business. The most popular survival strategy was the production of malt syrup, a thick, sweet extract of malted barley sold openly in grocery stores with the transparent pretense that it was meant for baking. Everyone knew the truth, including the authorities who chose not to look too closely. The cans carried instructions for making a certain kind of drink, stopping just short of telling the buyer to add yeast. Some even included warnings not to do the very thing that would produce alcohol, a wink so broad it was practically a shout. The malt syrup trade was a perfect symbol of the larger failure of the ban. The law had made beer illegal, but it had not made it unwanted. Americans continued to drink in hidden bars, in private homes, in the back rooms of clubs in quantities far greater than the reformers had imagined. The ban did more than close breweries. It destroyed an entire culture. The saloon, for all its genuine problems, had been the center of working-class social life, a place where men gathered to drink, argue, organize, form political alliances, and participate in the broader life of their communities. The beer gardens that German immigrants had built offered a gentler, family-friendly model of public drinking, one that was swept away along with everything else. When the ban was finally lifted on December 5, 1933, the cheering crowds were celebrating the return of legal beer. But the world that beer had supported, the small breweries, the local traditions, the distinctive regional styles, the skilled workers and their accumulated knowledge, was gone. It could not simply be reassembled. The day the ban ended, the president reportedly said that he thought it would be a good time for a beer. He signed a law legalizing beer of a certain low strength, effective a few weeks later, and on that first evening of legal sales, a team of horses pulling a wagon loaded with beer barrels arrived at the front gate of the White House, a carefully staged moment of celebration. An estimated 1.5 million barrels of beer were consumed in the first 24 hours. But the industry that emerged from those 13 dry years was a fundamentally different thing from the one that had gone in. Only about 100 of the original 1,300 breweries reopened, and most of them were the large national operations with enough money to have survived. The small local breweries that had given American beer its character and its variety were gone for good. In their place, a handful of large companies would dominate the market for the next half-century, producing beer that grew steadily more standardized, more uniform, and more indistinguishable from one brand to the next. The ban did not just dry out America for 13 years. It permanently reshaped the landscape of American beer. And it is that reshaped landscape, the age of bland consensus, that we will explore next. In the spring of 1975, a retired football player stood in front of a TV camera, held up a can of a brand new beer, and delivered one of the most memorable lines in advertising history. "Less filling," he declared. His counterpart fired back, "Tastes great." This absurdly simple argument, repeated in dozens of commercials with an ever-changing cast of athletes and celebrities, became one of the most successful advertising campaigns in American history. And it introduced the product that would define the final chapter of American beer's long slide toward lightness, the low-calorie beer. The story of how American beer became the lightest, most neutral-flavored beer in the world is not a story of bad brewing. The major American breweries employed some of the finest technical minds in the industry, and their ability to produce a perfectly consistent, crystal-clear drink at enormous scale was a genuine achievement of engineering. The blandness was deliberate. It was a business decision. When the breweries that had survived the dry years reopened in 1933, they faced a fundamentally different world. The hundreds of small regional operations that had once produced a wide range of styles, dark lagers, malty brews, bitter ales, and robust porters, were gone. The survivors were large, national-scale companies that needed to sell to an entire continent of consumers with widely varying tastes. The safest strategy was to produce the most broadly inoffensive beer possible, a light-colored, light-bodied, mildly flavored lager designed to appeal to the largest number of people while offending no one. The use of grains other than barley, mainly corn and rice, was central to this approach. These additions lightened the body and smoothed the flavor. Before the ban on alcohol, brewers had used these additions at modest rates. Afterward, the proportions crept steadily higher until some brands contained nearly half non-barley grain. The result was a beer with less character, less bitterness, less body, and less flavor of any kind than virtually any beer made elsewhere in the world. The consolidation of the market followed a relentless pattern. Large breweries with national reach, massive advertising budgets, and economies of scale systematically absorbed or outcompeted smaller competitors. A brewery producing 10 million barrels a year could spread its costs over a much larger base than one producing 50,000. The math was simple and unavoidable. Between 1950 and 1970, more than 300 American breweries closed, their distinctive local brands swallowed up and eventually discontinued. The cultural impact was as deep as the economic one. Before the ban on alcohol, American beer culture had been richly regional. Different cities had their own styles, their own flavor preferences, their own local loyalties. The post-war consolidation erased these differences, replacing variety with uniformity. By the 1970s, the differences between the major national brands were so slight that they competed almost entirely on image and price rather than on the character of the beer itself. The Second World War accelerated the trend. During the war, breweries received reduced grain supplies and were required to produce beer for the military at lower strength. The beer shipped to troops overseas was lighter and milder than anything made before the war. When the soldiers came home, they were accustomed to this thinner product, and the breweries were not inclined to go back to a more flavorful recipe when the lighter version was selling just fine. The generation that fought the war became the generation that drank the blandest beer in American history, and they passed the taste to their children. Television, which arrived as a mass medium in the 1950s, proved to be the most powerful force in the consolidation. Beer advertising had existed for a long time, but television amplified its reach beyond anything that had come before. The national brands poured enormous sums into campaigns that reached tens of millions of people at once, building the kind of brand recognition that no small regional brewery could match. Between 1945 and 1978, the number of breweries in the United States fell from roughly 450 to fewer than 50. By 1978, the 6 largest companies controlled more than 90% of the entire American beer market. The low-calorie beer introduced in 1975 was the final step. The concept was not new. A small Chicago brewery had tried it years earlier and failed. What made this version succeed was the marketing. By positioning the beer as a drink for active, sports-loving men, backed by celebrity endorsements, and that unforgettable slogan, the brewery transformed a diet product into a mainstream choice. The success was enormous. Within 2 years, sales had nearly doubled. Every major brewery rushed to produce its own version. By the early 2000s, low-calorie beer accounted for nearly half of all beer sold in America. The irony was hard to miss. The most popular beer in the country that loved beer the most was a product specifically designed to contain less flavor, less body, less color, and less of nearly everything that had defined beer for 10,000 years. But beneath this bland surface, something was stirring. In garages and basements across the country, a generation of home brewers was quietly experimenting with the very flavors and styles that the big breweries had abandoned. They were making dark, bitter, hoppy, malty beers. They were reading about British and Belgian and German traditions. They were ordering specialty ingredients from tiny suppliers. They were, in their stubborn, amateur way, reinventing American beer from the ground up. And now, let us look at how European beer traveled with European empires to every corner of the globe. In 1903, on a rocky headland overlooking the coast of eastern China, a group of German and British businessmen opened a brewery. The city was a German colonial concession, seized from China just 5 years earlier. The brewery was built with German equipment, run by German brewmasters, and operated according to the German purity law. But the water came from local mountain springs, soft and clean, and it produced a lager of remarkable crispness. The beer was meant for the German soldiers and settlers, but it quickly found a wider audience among Chinese drinkers who had never tasted anything like it. When Germany lost its overseas territories after the First World War, the brewery passed first into Japanese hands and then into Chinese ownership. Today, that beer is the most widely exported Chinese beer in the world, sold in more than 100 countries, a quiet legacy of colonial ambition that outlasted the empire that created it. This pattern, European colonizers arriving in distant lands and building breweries to supply their communities with familiar drink, repeated itself across the globe during the Age of Empire. Wherever European powers established military outposts, trading posts, and settler colonies, they brought beer with them. When imported beer proved too expensive or too fragile to survive the long sea voyage, they built local operations. The result was a global network of breweries that transplanted European methods, ingredients, and drinking culture into environments as varied as the tropics of Southeast Asia, the highlands of East Africa, the plains of India, and the temperate zones of Australia and South Africa. In India, the challenge of brewing in extreme heat was formidable. Bacteria thrived in the warmth, and imported beer often arrived spoiled beyond recognition after months at sea. Colonial brewers responded by setting up operations in the cooler hill stations of northern India, where the altitude provided somewhat friendlier conditions. The first brewery on the subcontinent was established in the foothills of the Himalayas in 1830, and by the 1880s, more than a dozen were operating in the region, producing lagers better suited to the local climate than the ales shipped from England. German-style lagers, lighter and more refreshing than heavy British ales, proved especially popular in the tropical heat. Africa's encounter with European industrial beer is a story of creation and displacement. The continent had its own deep and varied brewing traditions, sorghum beers, millet beers, and honey-based drinks that had sustained communities and ceremonies for thousands of years. Colonial breweries, built to serve European settlers, introduced a fundamentally different kind of beer: clear, carbonated, factory-made, bottled and branded. In Kenya, two brothers founded a brewery in the early 1920s, producing a lager named after an elephant that had killed one of them on a hunting expedition. That beer became the national drink of Kenya. In South Africa, a brewery in Johannesburg produced a lager that would become the foundation of one of the largest brewing companies in Africa, and eventually one of the largest in the world. The spread of European beer across the colonial world was not just a matter of settlers drinking their own familiar beverage in new places. It was also a vehicle for cultural change. Colonial governments often actively encouraged local populations to switch from traditional homebrewed drinks to commercially produced beer, arguing that factory beer was safer and more modern. In practice, these arguments often served economic rather than health-related purposes. Commercial beer could be taxed, generating revenue for the colonial state, while homebrewed beer could not. The shift from traditional to commercial brewing also disrupted centuries-old social practices and gender roles, since traditional brewing across much of Africa and Asia was women's work, while commercial breweries were owned and operated by men. In Southeast Asia, the Dutch built breweries in their island colonies, the French in their territories, and the British in theirs. One of the most famous Asian beers was first brewed in Singapore in 1932, a joint venture between a Dutch company and a local firm. It became one of the most iconic brands in the region. In Indonesia, the Dutch established a brewery that would produce the beer now considered the national brand. In Laos, a brewery that began production in the 1970s uses locally grown rice, giving its beer a distinctive character. Japan presents a particularly interesting case. Beer was introduced by Dutch traders in the early 1800s, and the first Japanese-owned brewery opened in 1872, just a few years after Japan opened itself to foreign influence and modern industry. The Japanese brewing industry grew rapidly, influenced by both German and American traditions, and by the early 20th century, Japan was producing lagers of exceptional quality. The four largest Japanese breweries emerged as dominant players, each making crisp, clean lagers that reflected a cultural emphasis on precision and consistency. In 1987, one of them introduced a beer with an exceptionally sharp, clean flavor that became a sensation, reshaping the entire Japanese market and inspiring imitations around the world. Japan's embrace of beer was so thorough that by the late 20th century, beer had largely displaced the traditional rice drink as the everyday alcoholic beverage of the working population. The legacy of colonial beer is a complicated one. It created brands that continue to define national identities from China to Kenya to Singapore. It brought modern brewing technology to regions that had practiced traditional fermentation for millennia. But it also pushed aside and diminished indigenous brewing traditions that were deeply woven into the social, spiritual, and economic life of colonized peoples. The tension between imported industrial beer and local traditional drinks remains a living issue in many parts of the world, a reminder that the global spread of beer was never simply a story of refreshment. It was always, at some level, a story of power. And now, let us return to America, where a quiet revolution was about to rescue beer from the grip of blandness. On a foggy San Francisco afternoon in the autumn of 1965, a 27-year-old man walked into a bar and ordered a glass of his favorite local beer. The bartender shook his head. "You better drink it while you can," he said. "They're going to close the brewery." The young man, curious and impulsive, asked for directions and drove across town to see the place for himself. What he found was a small, run-down operation on the verge of collapse, making a unique style of beer that no one else in America produced, a beer fermented with lager yeast at warmer temperatures, creating something that was neither quite ale nor quite lager, but something distinctly its own. The brewery was dirty, the equipment was failing, and the owner was desperate to sell. The young man, who had never brewed a single batch of beer in his life, bought a controlling share for a few $1,000s. His name was Fritz Maytag, and that impulsive purchase would set in motion a revolution. The early years were hard. The brewery was losing money, the beer was inconsistent, and the entire American market was moving in exactly the opposite direction. This was the age of the big national brands, of light lagers sold through massive television campaigns, of a beer market that valued uniformity above all else. Maytag's beer was dark, complex, and idiosyncratic, a survivor from another era struggling to stay alive in the modern world. He invested his own money, taught himself the science and art of brewing through relentless study and trial, and gradually brought the quality and consistency of the beer up to a level he could be proud of. He began bottling it for the first time in 1971, expanding its reach beyond the handful of bars that had been its only market. Over the following years, he introduced a range of new beers, including a porter, one of the first modern American pale ales brewed with a bold new hop variety, and a different holiday brew each year. What Maytag proved against all conventional wisdom was that there was a market for beer with actual flavor in America. It was a small market, to be sure, but it was real and it was growing, fed by a generation of Americans who had traveled to Europe and tasted the beers of Belgium, England, and Germany, and who could not understand why nothing remotely similar was available at home. The second critical event in this story was the legalization of home brewing. Since 1919, it had been illegal for Americans to brew beer at home, a relic of the alcohol ban that was never cleaned up when the ban was repealed. On a day in October of 1978, the president signed a bill into law that included a small provision allowing the production of limited quantities of beer and wine at home. The provision was modest and received almost no attention in the press, but its impact was enormous. Almost overnight, a community of passionate homebrewers sprang into being across the country. They were engineers, teachers, lawyers, and students, people who brewed in their garages and kitchens and basements. They ordered specialty grains and hops from the handful of supply shops that had begun to appear. They devoured books on British, Belgian, and German brewing traditions. They shared recipes through newsletters, clubs, and eventually, early internet forums. A national organization for homebrewers, founded that same year, became the hub of this growing community, publishing a magazine, hosting competitions, and building a network through which enthusiasts could connect and learn. The leap from home brewing to commercial production happened quickly. A former Navy mechanic who had developed a love of British ales while stationed in Scotland opened what is generally considered the first modern small-scale brewery in America in Northern California in 1976, 2 years before home brewing was even legal. His tiny operation produced pale ale, stout, and porter in quantities so small that the beer was available only at a few local restaurants. The brewery closed after 6 years, but its example inspired a generation of would-be brewers who saw in it proof that small-scale, quality-focused brewing was possible. The small breweries that followed were founded almost without exception by home brewers. 2 friends in Northern California who had been brewing at home for years cobbled together a brew house from scrap dairy equipment in a small warehouse, financed with loans from friends and family. Their pale ale, brewed with a hop variety that the major breweries considered too bold for the American palate, became a landmark. That hop, with its distinctive grapefruit and floral character, had been developed years earlier and largely ignored. This small brewery proved that the hop was not too bold. It was exactly what a new generation of drinkers had been waiting for. Another founder, a management consultant who left his corporate career to pursue his family's brewing heritage, launched a lager based on a recipe from his great-great-grandfather. Unlike the others who built their own small breweries, he initially had his beer made at existing facilities, allowing him to focus on sales and distribution. His brand became the first small batch beer to achieve truly national reach, and his personal approach, going bar to bar with samples, established a template for how craft beer could be sold. By the early 1990s, the word microbrewery had entered the American vocabulary. There were roughly 200 small craft breweries operating in the country in 1990, up from fewer than 10 a decade earlier. The revolution that had started with one man's impulsive purchase of a failing brewery that had been enabled by a law almost nobody noticed, and that had been fueled by a generation of stubborn amateurs brewing in their garages, was well and truly underway. And the revolution was about to get a whole lot hoppier. In a small, cluttered brewery in the village of Waterbury, Vermont in 2003, a brewer cracked open a can of a beer he had named and held it up to the light. The liquid was cloudy, almost opaque, a hazy golden orange that looked nothing like the crystal-clear beers that had dominated American brewing for a century. It smelled like a tropical fruit salad, an explosion of mango and grapefruit and pine that hit the nose before the glass even reached the lips. The flavor was soft and juicy, intensely hoppy, but without the harsh, puckering bitterness of the traditional style. This was not just a new beer. It was a new idea, a radical rethinking of what a hoppy beer could be. Within a few years, it would spawn an entirely new category and trigger the most dramatic shift in taste in the history of American craft brewing. The hop explosion that transformed American beer in the 2000s and 2010s had its roots in the earlier craft movement. The small breweries of the 1980s had shown that Americans could appreciate bold, hop-forward flavors, but the early craft versions of the bitter pale ale style were relatively restrained by the standards of what was to come. What changed was both the ambition of the brewers and the range of hops available to them. The foundation had been laid decades earlier with a hop variety that the major breweries had dismissed as too strong for mainstream taste. Its distinctive grapefruit and floral character was considered aggressive, even off-putting. But for the new generation of craft brewers, it was a revelation, the hop that tasted like America. In the years that followed, plant breeders built on that first variety to produce a succession of even more intensely aromatic types. One, released at the turn of the millennium, added pine and a distinctive earthy quality. Another, released a few years later, was a breakthrough, delivering an unprecedented burst of tropical fruit, passion fruit and mango, flavors that had never before been associated with beer. Yet another offered a similarly complex profile with hints of berries and herbs. These new varieties gave craft brewers a palette of flavors as rich and diverse as any spice rack, and they used it freely. The competition to push bitterness to new extremes produced some extraordinary beers and some absurd ones. One Delaware brewery created a version so intensely hopped, with a brewing process that took 2 full hours of continuous hop additions, that its bitterness level soared far beyond what the human tongue can actually perceive. Stronger versions pushed the alcohol level to 8, 9, even 12%, creating intensely hoppy, intensely alcoholic drinks that bore little resemblance to the moderate-strength ales from the British tradition that had originally inspired the style. Then came the haze craze. The cloudy, juicy style that emerged from that Vermont brewery represented a deliberate turn away from the bitterness-focused approach of the earlier movement. Where the earlier style prized clarity, dryness, and aggressive bite, the new approach celebrated cloudiness, softness, and rounded fruit flavors. The haze came from a combination of proteins, suspended yeast, and compounds from massive amounts of hops added during and after fermentation rather than during the boil. A biological process in which yeast enzymes chemically transformed the hop compounds, creating entirely new aromatic molecules, gave these beers their distinctive juicy, tropical character, flavors that could not be achieved through traditional methods. Not everyone was thrilled. Traditionalists argued that the relentless focus on one ingredient had crowded out the diversity of styles that the craft movement was supposed to celebrate. Why, they asked, were nearly all the taps at a craft beer bar pouring some variation of the same hoppy style, when the world of beer included pilsners, stouts, wheat beers, lagers, sour ales, and hundreds of other possibilities? The stereotype of the obsessive hop enthusiast, a young man fixated on bitterness numbers and limited release bottles, became a gentle target of mockery within the beer community itself. Writers complained of palate fatigue and pleaded for brewers to make something, anything, that did not taste like a tropical forest. The culture of extreme brewing extended beyond hops. One brewer built his brand around the idea of using ancient and unusual ingredients, things like saffron and rare spices, often inspired by recipes recreated from archaeological evidence. A Scottish brewery courted attention with increasingly outrageous creations, including one that was among the strongest beers ever made, served in a bottle encased in a preserved animal. These stunts generated enormous publicity, but also drew criticism for putting spectacle ahead of substance. By the 2020s, the hoppy pale ale category had matured and diversified to such an extent that it was less a single style than a whole family. It encompassed everything from light, easy-drinking versions to hazy, juicy versions to bone-dry versions to creamy versions made with milk, sugar, and fruit. The hop that had once been considered too bold for the American palate had become the defining flavor of American beer, and the hoppy ale, in all its forms, had replaced the Pilsner as the style that defined a generation. The arms race produced some genuinely wonderful beers, some silly ones, and an entire industry built on the simple idea that beer could taste like something. That flavor was not a flaw but a virtue, and that the American palate was capable of appreciating boldness, complexity, and intensity that the bland age of the post-war years had never imagined possible. And that American Revolution in flavor did not stay in America. Let us see where it traveled next. On a grey November evening in 2007, in a garage in a small fishing town on the northeastern coast of Scotland, two young men stood over a makeshift brew kettle and argued about hops. One had abandoned a legal career before it started. The other was a trained brewer who had worked at a local operation. They had quit their jobs, borrowed money, and decided to start a brewery with no real business plan, no distribution network, and no particular reason to believe that a craft brewery in a remote Scottish village could succeed against the giant corporations that dominated the British beer market. What they had was an aggressive attitude, a conviction that mainstream beer had become bland and soulless, and a desire to make beer that demanded your attention. Their first flagship beer, a bold, hoppy pale ale, became the rallying cry of a new generation of European brewers who drew their inspiration not from their own traditions, but from the flavor-forward brewing culture of the American West Coast. Within a decade, that garage operation had grown into a company with breweries on 4 continents, taprooms in dozens of cities, and beer available in more than 60 countries. Its rise was one of the most dramatic stories in modern brewing and a signal that the craft revolution was no longer an American affair. It had gone global. The American craft beer movement, which had seemed uniquely American when it began in the 1980s, turned out to be the opening act of something much bigger. By the 2010s, small-scale brewing was booming on every inhabited continent, driven by the same forces that had powered it in the United States. Consumers wanted flavor and variety. Affordable brewing equipment made it possible for passionate individuals to set up shop. The internet connected brewers and enthusiasts across borders. And there was a growing cultural pushback against the sameness of the global beer market. In Scandinavia, the movement took a characteristically bold and experimental form. A former high school physics teacher in Copenhagen founded a brewery in 2006, but rather than building his own facility, he had his beers made under contract at other breweries. This freed him to experiment wildly, producing hundreds of different beers across every conceivable style. In Stockholm, another creative brewery pushed the boundaries with surreal label art and dessert-inspired beers that tasted like ice cream parlors in a glass. These Scandinavian brewers combined technical precision with an almost artistic sense of play. In Japan, the craft movement was unlocked by a change in regulations in 1994 that dramatically lowered the minimum production volume required for a brewing license. Suddenly, small-scale brewing was legally possible, and a wave of small operations appeared across the country. The early years were rocky, with quality issues and a market dominated by 4 enormous corporations. But by the 2010s, a new generation of Japanese brewers was producing ales and lagers of world-class quality, reflecting both American craft influences and a distinctly Japanese sensibility, a commitment to precision and refinement that set them apart. Australia followed a path similar to America's, with home brewers turning professional and building a culture of hop-forward, flavorful ales. A brewery in Western Australia, founded in 2000, produced a pale ale that introduced an entire generation of Australian drinkers to bold American hop flavors. Others followed, each building loyal local followings before expanding. In Latin America, particularly Brazil and Mexico, the craft wave arrived in the 2010s with considerable force. Brazil, long dominated by light, neutral lagers, saw hundreds of small breweries open, producing everything from hoppy American-style ales to Belgian-inspired strong brews. Mexico's craft movement, centered in cities like Mexico City and Tijuana, drew on both American influences and local culinary traditions. Perhaps the most surprising chapter was the arrival of craft brewing in countries with ancient and deeply conservative beer cultures. In Germany, where the purity law had constrained ingredients for 5 centuries, a new generation of brewers began pushing against the boundaries. They produced hoppy ales, sour beers, and barrel-aged dark beers that their grandparents would have considered unthinkable. They argued that innovation and tradition were not enemies but partners. In Belgium, where the extraordinary diversity of traditional styles might have seemed to leave no room for anything new, young breweries brought a modern sensibility to the old traditions, experimenting with new ingredients and techniques while respecting the country's remarkable heritage. Even in the Czech Republic, the homeland of Pilsner, small craft breweries began appearing, offering drinkers alternatives to the dominant national brands. The global craft wave revealed something important about the relationship between beer and culture. In every country where it took root, the movement was driven by the same fundamental tension: the desire for variety and individuality in a world increasingly dominated by corporate sameness. It was a rebellion not against beer itself, but against boredom. Not against tradition, but against the reduction of tradition to a marketing slogan. Whether in a garage in Scotland, a classroom in Copenhagen, or a warehouse in California, the people who built the craft revolution were united by a single belief: beer deserved so much better than what it had become. And yet, even as small breweries multiplied, the giants of the industry were busy consolidating, buying up competitors and craft brands alike. Let us look now at the era of mega mergers and the fight for the soul of beer. On a Monday morning in June of 2008, the head of a Belgian-Brazilian brewing company picked up the telephone and called the chairman of the most famous brewery in America, a man whose family had run the business for 5 generations. The message was blunt. His company was offering to buy the American brewery for $52 billion. The offer was unwelcome, unexpected, and in the end impossible to refuse. After weeks of negotiation and boardroom drama, the deal was done at an even higher price. The new combined company controlled roughly a quarter of all beer produced on Earth and owned a portfolio of brands spanning every continent. The American family that had built the brewery over 147 years was out. This acquisition was not an isolated event. It was the peak of a wave of consolidation that had been reshaping the global beer industry for decades. The logic was simple and relentless. In a mature industry where overall sales were growing slowly or not at all, the surest path to profit was to buy competitors, eliminate overlap, and use sheer size to drive down costs. The companies that pursued this strategy most aggressively came, oddly enough, from countries not traditionally known as beer powerhouses. The acquiring company was itself the product of a merger between a Belgian firm and a Brazilian group built by private equity investors who practiced a famously ruthless management style. Every expense, down to the number of paper towels in the washroom, was questioned and justified from scratch each year. After the American acquisition, the cost-cutting began immediately. Corporate perks were eliminated. Performance targets became the measure of everything. The family-oriented culture that had defined the old American brewery was replaced by a relentless focus on efficiency. This management approach spread through the global beer industry and influenced companies far beyond brewing. The consolidation did not stop there. A few years later, the same giant acquired another major global brewer in a deal valued at over $100 billion, one of the largest corporate takeovers in history. The combined company now controlled nearly a third of all beer sold on the planet, with a collection of more than 600 brands available in 150 countries. No single company had ever dominated a global beverage market to such a degree. The craft beer community watched with a mixture of alarm and defiance. The growing dominance of a handful of mega-corporations posed serious questions for independent brewers. The giants' control of distribution networks, retail relationships, and advertising budgets created barriers that small breweries struggled to overcome. In the United States, craft brewers complained that the dominant company's agreements with distributors made it hard for independent beers to reach store shelves and bar taps. More controversially, the mega brewers began buying craft breweries themselves. The acquisition of a beloved Chicago craft brewery in 2011 sent shockwaves through the beer world. That brewery made one of the most celebrated dark ales in America, and its purchase by the company that made the country's lightest beer felt, to many enthusiasts, like a betrayal. More acquisitions followed, one after another. In each case, the craft brand continued to operate under its own name, but it was now owned by the same corporation it had defined itself against. This practice, sometimes called craft washing, created an identity crisis within the movement. If a small brewery's beer still tasted the same after being bought by a giant, did the ownership really matter? The American trade group representing independent craft breweries thought it did. They created a special seal, a small logo that member breweries could display to signal that they were truly independent. The seal was widely adopted, but the debate continued. Some argued that what mattered was the beer in the glass, not the name on the corporate letterhead. Others insisted that the entire point of craft beer was to support independent businesses and that buying a craft brand owned by the same company that made the blandest beer in the world was missing the point entirely. By the mid-2020s, the global beer industry had settled into an uneasy balance. The dominant company remained the largest, but its growth had slowed, and its aggressive cost-cutting had been blamed for weakening the appeal of some of its most important brands. The second largest global brewer pursued a different strategy, investing in premium positioning rather than pure efficiency. A handful of other major companies rounded out the top tier, each controlling significant market share in their own regions. The story of beer's corporate consolidation is, in many ways, a mirror of global business itself. The relentless pursuit of scale, the transformation of products with distinct local identities into globally standardized commodities, the tension between efficiency and quality, between the boardroom and the brewhouse. For the billions of people who drink the world's most popular brands without a second thought about who owns them, the consolidation is invisible. But for the independent brewers and beer lovers who see every small brewery as a small act of resistance against corporate sameness, the stakes feel very high indeed. The battle between efficiency and passion, between scale and soul, is far from finished. And now, let us step away from the world of business and into some of the most beloved spaces on earth, the places where people actually sit down and drink their beer. On a quiet Wednesday evening in a small village in the English countryside, a man pushes open a heavy oak door and steps inside. The room is low-ceilinged and warm, lit by wall lamps and the soft glow of a fire in a stone hearth. The bar is a slab of dark wood, worn smooth by generations of elbows. Behind it, 3 hand pumps dispense ales brewed within 30 miles of this spot. A dog sleeps beneath one of the tables. 2 men play darts in the corner. An elderly couple share a basket of fried potatoes and a pint of bitter, speaking in the unhurried rhythm of people who have known each other for decades. There is no TVV, no music, no complicated menu. There is beer, there is conversation, and there is the comfortable silence of a room that has been fulfilling exactly this purpose for centuries. This is the English pub, the public house, an institution so deeply woven into the fabric of British life that its decline in recent decades is mourned as a kind of social death. The concept of a public place for drinking stretches all the way back to the Roman establishments that dotted the roads of ancient Britain. After the Romans left, local alehouses took their place, run by women who brewed on the premises and signaled the availability of fresh ale by hanging a green branch or a broomstick over the door. By the medieval period, these had evolved into distinct types of drinking places, each serving a different social level. But it was the pub, a later evolution that combined elements of all of them, that became the defining social institution of British life. The architecture of the traditional pub developed over centuries into something distinctive and warm. There was the snug, a small enclosed room offering privacy for women, couples, or anyone who wished to drink away from the crowd. There was the public bar, larger and noisier, the domain of working men. There was the saloon bar, slightly more polished. Etched glass, brass fittings, tiled floors, and decorative details created an atmosphere of warmth and permanence designed to feel like a home away from home. And the rituals of the pub, the round system where each member of a group takes a turn buying for everyone, the custom of standing at the bar, the unwritten rules of conversation, these form a cultural code as intricate as any in British society. Now let us travel to Germany, where an entirely different kind of drinking space holds a similarly sacred place. The beer garden, the outdoor table beneath the chestnut trees, was born from the practical habit of planting trees above underground cellars to shade them from the summer heat. When people began gathering under those trees to drink the cold lager stored below, a tradition was created. The Munich beer garden, in particular, developed into a remarkably democratic space. The old custom of bringing your own food, still observed in many traditional gardens today, reinforced a sense of equality. A wealthy merchant and a factory worker might share the same table, drinking the same beer, united by the simple pleasure of sitting outdoors on a warm afternoon. The beer garden holds a protected legal status in Bavaria, a recognition that these spaces are cultural institutions, not merely businesses. In the Czech Republic, the neighborhood pub holds a comparable place. The Czech people consistently lead the world in per capita beer consumption, and their local drinking house is a temple of straightforward pleasures. The atmosphere is conversational rather than festive. The server brings fresh beers automatically, marking each delivery on a small card at the table. When the drinker places a coaster over the glass, the evening is over. There is a simplicity and a directness to the experience that reflects a deep respect for the beer itself. The Czech pub has historically served as a forum for relaxed, extended discussion, a place where ideas flow as freely as the lager. In Japan, there is a type of establishment that serves a function both similar to and different from its European counterparts. The word for it combines the ideas of staying and sake shop, and it originated centuries ago when drink sellers began allowing customers to linger on the premises. Over time, these places evolved into full establishments offering food, drink, and a social atmosphere fundamentally different from the formality of ordinary Japanese restaurants. The rigid social structures of Japanese working life relax inside these walls. Colleagues drink together after a long day. The carefully maintained social masks can slip a little. Communication flows more freely than it does in the office. The Japanese even have a word for this, a blend of to drink and communication, capturing the idea of drinking as a pathway to authentic human connection. The Irish pub deserves special mention for its extraordinary global reach. Beginning with the great waves of Irish emigration in the 19th century, Irish pubs appeared wherever Irish communities settled, in Boston, New York, London, Sydney, Buenos Aires, and far beyond. These pubs served as gathering places for people far from home, offering familiar drink, traditional music, and the warmth of shared identity. In the 1990s, the Irish pub concept went global on a commercial scale, with companies offering complete packages, fixtures, furnishings, and all to entrepreneurs around the world. Today, there are more than 7,000 Irish-style pubs in over 30 countries, making the Irish pub one of the most successful cultural exports of modern times. The newest addition to beer's sacred spaces is the American tap room, born alongside the craft beer revolution. Unlike the pub, which is a general social gathering place that happens to serve beer, the tap room is a purpose-built space attached to a brewery designed specifically for drinking that brewery's products. The taproom model transformed the economics of small brewing by allowing breweries to sell directly to customers. The typical taproom is a large open space with high ceilings, long communal tables, a row of gleaming taps, and a deliberately casual atmosphere. Food often comes from a truck parked outside. Dogs are nearly always welcome. The feeling is local, relaxed, and proudly informal. All of these spaces, the pub, the beer garden, the Czech neighborhood house, the Japanese drinking establishment, the Irish diaspora pub, the American taproom, are expressions of the same ancient truth. Beer is not merely a drink. It is a reason to gather, a way to connect, and a vehicle for the kind of relaxed, honest conversation that holds communities together. The specific form changes from culture to culture, but the underlying purpose is always the same. And now, let us look at beer in the wider world of culture, in festivals, in art, in music, and in the stories we tell. On the 12th of October 1810, the people of Munich gathered on a meadow at the edge of their city to celebrate a royal wedding. The groom was a crown prince of Bavaria, the bride a princess from a neighboring state. The celebration included horse races, military parades, music, and of course, vast quantities of Bavarian beer. The meadow was named in honor of the bride, and the festival was so thoroughly enjoyed that the citizens asked to do it again the following year. They did, and the year after that, and the year after that, for more than 2 centuries running, until what began as a one-time royal party had grown into the largest folk festival in the world. Today, this festival draws more than 6 million visitors each year. Over 16 days, they consume roughly 7 million liters of beer, served in 1-liter glass steins by servers who navigate the packed tents with a strength and grace that would impress any athlete. Only beer brewed within the city limits of Munich by one of 6 approved breweries may be served. This rule, rooted in the old tradition of local purity, ensures that the festival remains a celebration of Bavarian beer culture rather than a generic party. The beer itself, a special amber lager brewed at higher strength for the occasion, is available nowhere else in quite the same form. The rituals of the festival, from the ceremonial tapping of the first barrel by the mayor to the brass band performances to the communal singing, create an atmosphere that is at once festive and deeply traditional. The connection between beer and music is as old as beer itself. The ancient hymn to the brewing goddess, inscribed on clay tablets nearly 4,000 years ago, was almost certainly meant to be sung. Throughout the medieval period, drinking songs were a fixture of tavern life, serving as entertainment, as social bonding, and often as a vehicle for political humor and protest. The German tradition of drinking songs reached its height in the 18th and 19th centuries, producing melodies that are still sung in beer gardens and at festivals today. One short toasting song, just a few words long, interrupts conversation at regular intervals throughout every session at the Great Munich Festival, and visitors from around the world quickly learn to sing along, even if they do not speak a word of German. Beer has left its mark on the visual arts across cultures and centuries. Ancient Egyptian tomb paintings show the entire brewing process in careful detail. A 16th century Flemish painter captured village life with an earthy realism that makes you almost smell the ale, his scenes of peasant feasts and wedding celebrations placing beer at the center of communal joy. Another Flemish painter of the following century, who spent much of his short life in taverns, depicted the social world of the alehouse with a psychological intensity that went beyond mere illustration, painting faces flushed with drink, arguments about to boil over, and the quiet intimacy of 2 friends sharing a drink. Beer advertising emerged as an art form of its own in the 19th century, when new printing techniques made colorful posters affordable. Breweries commissioned artists to create images of idealized beer drinking, smiling figures holding foaming glasses, prosperous people raising toasts in elegant halls, and happy families gathered in sunlit outdoor gardens. These images, now prized by collectors, form a visual archive of changing attitudes toward beer and drinking culture. The 20th century moved beer advertising to radio and then to television, where it became one of the most culturally influential categories of commercial media. One of the most recognizable advertising images in American history involves a team of enormous draft horses, introduced in 1933 to celebrate the end of the alcohol ban. These horses were sent to deliver the first legal case of beer to the White House. Their annual appearances in the most watched television event in America became eagerly anticipated cultural moments, far beyond anything a beer advertisement might normally inspire. One commercial, broadcast shortly after a national tragedy in 2001, showed the horses crossing a famous bridge and bowing silently toward the city skyline. It was widely described as one of the most powerful television advertisements ever made, a piece of communication that transcended its commercial purpose entirely. The Great American Craft Beer Festival, founded in 1982, has become the premier showcase for the craft movement, drawing thousands of breweries and tens of thousands of visitors each year. Its medal competition, in which beers are judged without knowing their origin, is the most prestigious award in American craft brewing. A gold medal can transform the fortunes of a small brewery overnight. The festival has also inspired hundreds of smaller regional events across the country, each celebrating the local beer culture of its community. Beer's presence in the stories we tell, in books, in films, in television, is so constant that it often passes unnoticed, like the furniture in a familiar room. Comedy has long found rich material in the culture of beer drinking, from the gentle satire of a famous animated character's devotion to his local brand, to the pub-centered comedies of British television, to the lively debates between real ale enthusiasts that fill novels and films alike. In Germany, the tradition of the regular table at a local pub, a group of friends who meet on the same evening each week at the same reserved table, is so deeply embedded in social life that it functions as a kind of informal parliament, a forum for discussing everything from politics to personal troubles, all accompanied by the steady rhythm of glasses being filled and emptied. Beer, more than any other drink, belongs to the people. Wine has its experts and its vintage charts and its claims to refinement. Spirits have their cocktail bars and their specialists. But beer is democratic, accessible, and fundamentally communal. It is a drink best enjoyed not in solitary contemplation, but in the company of others, at a table, in a garden, under the open sky, with the sound of laughter and conversation and the occasional clink of glass against glass. And now, let us turn to a more complicated subject, the long and tangled relationship between beer and the human body. In the medical scrolls of ancient Egypt, dating to roughly 3,500 years ago, a physician wrote down a prescription for a patient with a troubled stomach. The remedy was simple: beer, mixed with herbs and honey, to be consumed warm before bed. This was not unusual. One of the oldest and most complete medical texts ever discovered lists beer as an ingredient in scores of remedies, used as a base for herbal treatments, as a nutritional supplement, as a digestive aid, and as a way to help patients swallow bitter medicines. For the Egyptians, beer was not just a drink or a food. It was a medicine, a central part of the doctor's toolkit. The idea that beer has healing properties persisted for a very long time. In medieval Europe, where monastic brewers were often the most learned people in their communities, beer was prescribed for everything from stomach complaints to infections to low spirits. The 12th century abbess and scholar we encountered earlier in our story recommended hopped beer for its ability to keep things from spoiling, one of the earliest European suggestions that hops had antiseptic value. The belief that a pint of good ale could ward off illness and strengthen the body was so widely accepted that it went essentially unchallenged for centuries. Then came the temperance movement, and the conversation changed completely. Alcohol was recast not as a medicine but as a poison, and beer not as a healthful drink but as a gateway to moral ruin, physical decay, and social chaos. The temperance argument was not entirely without foundation. The devastating effects of chronic heavy drinking, including liver disease, mental decline, heart problems, and the destruction of families were real and well documented. What the movement lacked was nuance. It drew no distinction between moderate enjoyment and destructive abuse, between a pint shared with friends and a bottle consumed alone. All drinking was sinful, and the only acceptable path was complete abstinence. The 20th century saw the pendulum swing back toward a more balanced view, at least among scientists. Studies conducted in the 1970s and 80s identified a curious pattern. People who drank moderately appeared to have lower rates of heart disease and overall death than either heavy drinkers or people who did not drink at all. The finding was surprising and controversial, but it appeared in study after study across different countries and populations. The proposed explanations centered on alcohol's effect on certain markers in the blood, including its ability to raise levels of a helpful type of substance that protected against the clotting events that cause heart attacks. For millions of moderate beer drinkers, this was welcome news. Science, it seemed, had confirmed what they had always believed, that a beer or two a day was not merely harmless but actively beneficial. That reassuring picture began to fall apart in the 2010s, and it has largely collapsed in the years since. Newer studies, using more careful methods to account for factors that the earlier research had missed, found that much of the apparent benefit of moderate drinking disappeared when the numbers were properly analyzed. One key problem was that the group of non-drinkers used for comparison included many people who had stopped drinking because they were already sick, making the moderate drinkers look healthier by contrast. A major study published in 2024, following more than 135,000 older adults, found that even moderate drinking was associated with higher rates of death from cancer and heart disease. Health authorities in the United States issued new warnings calling for labels on alcoholic beverages to inform people of the link between alcohol and cancer, the most significant change in labeling policy in 40 years. Beer contains things beyond alcohol that have interested researchers, including certain compounds from hops and barley, vitamins and minerals. Some studies have suggested that these might offer benefits independent of the alcohol, including effects on inflammation and bone health. But these possible benefits must be weighed against the well-established risks of drinking, including liver disease, neurological damage, harm to unborn children, and the devastating personal and social consequences of dependence. The emerging field of gut health has added a new dimension to the conversation. Early research suggests that certain compounds in unfiltered beer may support the growth of helpful bacteria in the digestive system. But this research is in its earliest stages, and the results are far from settled. The complex relationship between alcohol, plant compounds, gut bacteria, and overall health is only beginning to be understood. The human and social costs of alcohol are enormous and cannot be set aside. Alcohol dependence affects hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Alcohol contributes to roughly 3 million deaths each year globally, making it one of the leading preventable causes of death. The social toll, including domestic violence, traffic accidents, lost productivity, and the burden on healthcare systems, runs into hundreds of billions of dollars annually. These costs fall hardest on the poorest and most vulnerable communities, a sobering reality that complicates any celebration of beer's long and rich history. The eternal debate over beer and health is, in the end, a debate about risk, moderation, and the limits of personal choice. For a healthy adult who enjoys a beer or two with dinner, the individual risk of harm is small, though the latest science suggests it is not zero. For someone with a family history of dependence or a vulnerability to certain diseases, even moderate drinking may carry risks that outweigh any possible benefit. The ancient Egyptians who prescribed beer as medicine and the temperance campaigners who condemned it as poison were both, in their own ways, seeing only part of a larger picture. The full picture, as modern science is slowly revealing it, is complicated, nuanced, and unlikely to fit neatly into any single story. And now, let us look at the 4 simple ingredients that make beer what it is, and the remarkable science that modern brewers bring to their ancient craft. On a winter morning in the laboratory of a modern craft brewery, a brewer sits at a bench surrounded by glass vessels and measuring instruments, staring at a printout of numbers that would have been meaningless to every brewer who lived before the 20th century. The numbers describe the mineral content of the water she will use today. She has built this water from scratch, starting with water that has been stripped of all its minerals and adding back precisely measured amounts of specific salts until the profile matches her target. She is doing what brewers have done for centuries, making a hoppy, bitter pale ale, but with a level of precision and control that her predecessors could not have dreamed of. Water is beer's most abundant ingredient, making up 90 to 95% of the finished drink, and its chemical makeup affects everything. The minerals dissolved in the water shape, how enzymes work in the grain, how flavors are drawn from the hops, how the yeast behaves during fermentation, and how the beer tastes in the glass. Water with a high mineral content brings out hop bitterness and produces a dry, crisp beer. Water with a different mineral balance emphasizes the sweetness of the grain and creates a rounder, softer drink. The simple act of adjusting the mineral content of water has become one of the most important tools in the modern brewer's craft. Barley, the grain from which most of the world's beer is made, undergoes a remarkable transformation before it ever reaches the brewhouse. In the malting process, raw barley is soaked in water until it begins to sprout, activating the natural substances inside the grain that will later break down its starch into the sugars that yeast can eat. The sprouting is then stopped by heating the grain in a kiln, and it is the temperature and duration of this heating that determine the character of the malt. Low heat produces pale malts with mild, bready flavors. Moderate heat creates amber malts with notes of caramel and toffee. High heat produces dark, roasted malts with flavors of chocolate, coffee, and toast. A single grain, transformed by nothing more than water and carefully controlled heat, can produce an astonishing range of flavors. Hops, the cone-shaped flowers of a vigorous climbing plant, bring bitterness, aroma, and natural preservation to beer. The bitterness comes from certain compounds found in tiny glands at the base of the hop cone, compounds that change their shape when dissolved in boiling liquid, becoming much more bitter in the process. The longer the hops are boiled, the more bitterness they contribute. Hops added near the end of the boil, or after fermentation is complete, contribute less bitterness and more of the fragrant oils that give beer its aromatic character. Modern craft brewers have taken this principle to its extreme, adding enormous quantities of hops to their beer after fermentation in a technique called dry hopping, extracting maximum aroma with minimal additional bitterness. The oils within hops are extraordinarily complex, containing hundreds of distinct compounds that produce the floral, citrus, pine, tropical, and herbal aromas associated with different hop varieties. One compound contributes resinous, herbaceous notes. Another provides floral and citrus character. Yet another adds rose-like aromas. And certain sulfur-containing compounds present in only tiny amounts are responsible for the intense tropical fruit notes that define the most popular modern American hop varieties. During fermentation, yeast enzymes can transform these hop compounds, breaking them apart and reassembling them into entirely new aromatic molecules. This biological process has become a key area of research and a major factor in the development of the hazy, juicy beers that have taken the craft world by storm. And then there is yeast, the fourth ingredient and the most mysterious. Without yeast, the sugary liquid from the grain is just that, a sweet, dark tea. With yeast, it becomes beer. The primary job of yeast is to eat sugar and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. But this is only a small fraction of what it actually does. A single yeast cell, during the course of fermentation, produces hundreds of different compounds that profoundly shape the flavor and aroma of the finished beer. Some of these compounds produce fruity flavors, banana, apple, pear, and tropical fruit. Others produce spicy notes, like the clove character found in German wheat beers and Belgian ales. Still others contribute warmth, body, or harshness, depending on the amounts produced. The difference between a good brewer and a great one in the modern era comes down largely to controlling what the yeast does. Temperature, the amount of yeast added, the level of oxygen in the liquid, and dozens of other variables all influence the spectrum of flavors that yeast will produce. The same ingredients, fermented at a slightly different temperature, can yield a dramatically different beer. A skilled brewer manipulates these variables to achieve a precise flavor profile, whether that is a clean, neutral lager, a fruity Belgian ale, or a bold, estery English bitter. The science of modern brewing is, at its heart, the science of understanding four ingredients that humans have been using for 10,000 years. The water, the barley, the hops, and the yeast have not changed in their fundamental nature. What has changed, profoundly and beautifully, is our understanding of how they work together. That understanding began with Pasteur and Hansen in the 19th century and has expanded in the 21st into a body of knowledge that spans biology, chemistry, and the science of human perception. The modern brewer stands at the meeting point of art and science, of tradition and discovery, using tools that would astonish the pioneers of brewing science while pursuing a goal that a Sumerian priestess 4,000 years ago would have understood perfectly: to make good beer and to make it again tomorrow. Let us turn now to a question that is shaping the future of this ancient drink. What happens when a new generation decides it wants the ritual of beer without the alcohol? In the autumn of 2017, a young man in Connecticut poured out the last of his beer and decided to stop drinking. He was 31, fit, and successful. He did not consider himself an alcoholic. He was not in crisis. He simply noticed that his nightly habit of 2 or 3 craft beers was getting in the way of his sleep, his morning exercise, and his clarity of thought. The simplest solution, he decided, was to quit. But there was a problem. He genuinely loved beer. The ritual of opening a cold one at the end of a long day. The social ease of sharing a pint with friends. What he wanted was a beer that tasted like beer but contained no alcohol. He looked at what was available and found the options uniformly disappointing. Thin, sweet, metallic-tasting drinks that bore no resemblance to the craft beers he enjoyed. Within 2 years, he had co-founded a brewery dedicated entirely to making high-quality beer with no alcohol. By 2023, it had become one of the 15 largest craft breweries in the United States, without selling a single drop of alcohol. That rapid rise is the symptom of something much larger. Across the developed world, and particularly among younger consumers, drinking habits are changing with a speed that has alarmed the beer industry and intrigued observers. The generation born roughly between 1997 and 2012 drinks about 20% less alcohol per person than the generation before them did at the same age. In the United Kingdom, the proportion of young adults who report not drinking at all has risen sharply over the past 2 decades. In the United States, overall beer consumption per person has been declining steadily since its peak in the early 1980s, falling by more than 15% over 4 decades. The reasons are many and intertwined. Health consciousness is a major factor. Younger people, raised in an era of extraordinary access to nutritional and medical information, are more aware than any previous generation of the risks associated with alcohol. The recent studies linking even moderate drinking to increased risk of cancer and heart disease have reinforced a message that many young people had already absorbed through social media, through wellness culture, and through an increasingly cautious public health establishment. The very idea of well-being has shifted. Where earlier generations associated socializing with drinking, younger consumers are more likely to associate well-being with clear-headedness, productivity, and physical performance, values that sit uncomfortably alongside regular alcohol use. A broader cultural movement has given this shift a name and a community. It is sometimes called the sober curious movement, a term that captures the attitude of people who are not necessarily opposed to alcohol, but are actively questioning its place in their lives. This is not the same as sobriety in the traditional sense. It is an exploratory posture, a willingness to skip the drink, to order a non-alcoholic beer without embarrassment, to attend a gathering and stay clear-headed without feeling like an outsider. The movement has been amplified by social media, where related ideas have accumulated billions of views, and by a growing number of sober bars, alcohol-free social events, and drink menus at fine restaurants that now include thoughtful non-alcoholic options alongside the wine and cocktail lists. The non-alcoholic beer market has exploded in response. Globally, this segment was valued at roughly $20 billion in 2023, and analysts expect it to more than double within a decade. In the United States, sales of non-alcoholic beer at bars and restaurants grew by more than a third in a single year, with the hoppy styles surging most dramatically. The category is no longer a quiet afterthought. It is projected to overtake traditional ale as the second largest beer category worldwide by volume, trailing only lager. What has made this growth possible is a revolution in quality. The old methods of producing non-alcoholic beer, which tended to strip the flavor along with the alcohol, have given way to modern techniques that preserve the complexity of a full-strength brew. Several major and independent breweries have demonstrated that non-alcoholic beer can be genuinely excellent, winning blind tastings and earning praise from critics who would have dismissed the entire category a decade ago. The established beer industry has responded with a mix of enthusiasm and worry. Every major global brewer has launched or acquired non-alcoholic brands. The strategic logic is straightforward. If consumers are going to drink less alcohol, brewers want to capture that spending rather than lose it to sparkling water, tea, or other alternatives. But the economics are different from traditional beer. Producing high-quality non-alcoholic beer often costs more than making the alcoholic version, yet consumers tend to expect a lower price for something without alcohol. The margins are tighter, and many companies view the category as a way to stay relevant rather than as a major profit center. The cultural implications run deep. For 10,000 years, beer has been inseparable from alcohol. Its social role, its ritual significance, its function as a reward, a relaxant, and a social bond, all of these have depended, to varying degrees, on the effects of the alcohol it contains. If a significant number of people choose to drink beer without alcohol, what remains? The answer, as it turns out, is more than many skeptics expected. The flavor, the ritual, the social context, the craftsmanship, all of these persist in a glass of well-made non-alcoholic beer. The experience of sitting with friends in a pub, each holding a glass, talking and laughing as the evening deepens, is not fundamentally different whether the drink contains alcohol or not. The sober curious movement is testing, for the first time in human history, the idea that beer's cultural power does not depend on its ability to intoxicate. Whether this is a permanent shift or a passing fashion is the question that keeps industry leaders awake at night. The data so far points towards something lasting. The beer of the future, it seems increasingly clear, will need to be many things to many people. And among the challenges facing that future, none may be greater than the one we will consider next, the changing climate of the planet itself. In the rolling hills of Bavaria, the region that has produced the bulk of the world's hops for more than 1,000 years, a quiet crisis has been unfolding. Farmers who have tended hop fields for generations are watching their harvests decline. The vines wilt under increasingly frequent heat waves. The chemical profile of the flowers is shifting in ways that worry brewers. Scientists studying hop production across Europe have documented a steady decrease in both the bitter compounds and the aromatic oils that give hops their character. The cause is not disease or neglect. It is the slowly rising temperatures and changing rain patterns of a warming world. One study projected that European hop yields could fall by as much as 18% by the middle of this century, with the most severe losses concentrated in the traditional growing regions of Germany, the Czech Republic and Slovenia, that have defined the taste of European beer for centuries. Hops are among the most climate-sensitive of all crops. They thrive in temperate regions with long summer days, cool nights, and reliable moisture. These are precisely the conditions most threatened by climate change. Rising temperatures shorten the critical balance of daylight and darkness that triggers the plant's flowering cycle. Heat during the flowering period reduces the formation of the cones that brewers prize. Drought cuts yields directly, while erratic rainfall increases the risk of disease. The main hop-growing region of Bavaria has already experienced measurable warming since the 1970s, and the effects are visible in every harvest report. Barley, beer's other essential crop, faces a parallel set of challenges. Global barley production is concentrated in a band of temperate zones stretching from Western Europe through Russia, Australia, and the northern plains of North America. Climate models project more frequent and more severe heat waves, droughts, and extreme weather across these regions. One widely discussed study estimated that under a severe warming scenario, global barley yields could decline by 3 to 17%, depending on the region. The researchers calculated that extreme weather events occurring as often as every 3 years under high emission scenarios could reduce global beer consumption by 16% and double the price of beer in some markets. The countries hit hardest would be the ones where beer is cheapest relative to income, a cruel irony in which the burden falls most heavily on the world's most enthusiastic beer-drinking nations. And then there is water, the ingredient that makes up 90 to 95% of every glass. Brewing is a water-intensive process. Producing a single liter of beer requires, on average, 5 to 6 liters of water just for the brewing itself. When you include the water needed to grow the grain and the hops, some estimates put the total at closer to 75 liters for every liter of finished beer. In regions where water is already scarce, breweries face growing competition with farms, factories, and cities for a shrinking supply. Major river systems that supply water to brewing operations have seen their flows decline significantly due to persistent drought. The brewing industry has not been sitting idle. Many large breweries have invested heavily in using water more efficiently, cutting their water-to-beer ratio in some facilities to less than half the historical average. Smaller craft breweries have pursued efficiency through smarter processes, water recycling, and partnerships with local utilities. Some have gone further, investing in restoring watersheds and conserving wetlands, recognizing that the long-term health of their industry depends on the health of the water systems around them. On the farming front, researchers are pursuing multiple paths. Plant breeders are developing barley varieties that can tolerate drought and heat, drawing on the genetic diversity of wild grasses from the dry regions of Central Asia where barley first evolved. For hops, the challenge is harder. The plant's dependence on specific conditions of light and temperature makes it difficult to adapt through breeding alone. Some scientists are experimenting with growing hops indoors, in controlled environments that are entirely separate from the weather outside. Others are investigating whether specially engineered yeast strains could produce hop-like flavors on their own without the need for hop agriculture at all. The idea horrifies traditionalists but intrigues food scientists. A more radical vision of the future involves what is called precision fermentation, the use of engineered microorganisms to produce specific flavor compounds in laboratory settings. Researchers have already developed yeast strains that can create certain hop-derived aromas during fermentation without any hops being added to the beer. Similar work is being done on malt-derived flavors. In this vision of post-agricultural brewing, the fundamental flavors of beer would be produced not on farms but in laboratories, using simple sugars and designer organisms. This remains largely theoretical, but the science is advancing quickly, pushed by the same pressures reshaping food production everywhere: a changing climate, shrinking resources, and the relentless logic of efficiency. Sustainability has become a central concern for breweries of all sizes. The total environmental impact of beer extends far beyond the energy used in the brewhouse. It includes the land, water, and fuel needed to grow and transport grain and hops, the energy of malting and kilning, the refrigeration required for lager, the glass and aluminum of the packaging, and the trucks and ships that carry the finished product to market. Breweries have pursued a range of strategies, from switching to renewable energy to capturing the carbon dioxide produced during fermentation and reusing it. The question of what beer will taste like at the end of this century is, at its deepest level, a question about how well we adapt. Beer has survived the transition from wild grain to cultivated barley, from open-air fermentation to pure yeast cultures, from wooden barrels carried by hand to refrigerated trains spanning continents. At each step, the drink changed, sometimes dramatically, in response to new ingredients, new technologies, and new realities. There is no reason to think this era will be any different. The beer of the future may be brewed with drought-resistant grains, flavored by compounds produced in laboratories, made with recycled water in carbon-neutral breweries, and enjoyed by a generation that expects its food and drink to be sustainable and transparent. It will be different from the beer we know today, just as today's beer is different from a medieval alewife's cloudy herbal ale, and just as that ale was different from the thin, fizzing gruel that someone tasted in a cave 13,000 years ago. What will not change, in all likelihood, is the impulse itself. The desire to gather together and share a drink made from grain, water, and the invisible work of tiny organisms. That impulse has endured for 10,000 years, and it shows no sign of fading. And now, as we near the end of our journey, let us look back at the long road we have traveled and reflect on what it all means. We have come a long way together, you and I, from a cave in the mountains of ancient Israel to the gleaming brewhouses and quiet taprooms of the modern world. Let us pause here as the story draws to its close and look back at the road we have traveled. It began with an accident. Somewhere around 13,000 years ago, a group of people left a bowl of crushed grain in the warmth of a burial cave, and invisible forces transformed it into something no one had ever tasted before. A thin, fizzing, slightly sour drink that altered the mind and brought people together. That first bewildering sip set in motion a chain of events that may have helped push humanity from wandering to farming, from foraging to settling down, from scattered bands to the first great civilizations. We visited the land between the rivers, where the Sumerians wrote hymns to a goddess of brewing and paid their workers in beer. We saw how women in nearly every culture on Earth were the original brewers, grinding the grain, tending the pots, and running the taverns where communities gathered. We traveled to Egypt, where beer was the liquid bread that built the pyramids and the gift that saved the world from a wrathful goddess. We stood at the edge of the Roman Empire and watched the old divide between wine and beer, between so-called civilization and so-called barbarism, shape the drinking habits of a continent for centuries. We crossed oceans and visited the many places where beer was invented independently in the Andes, where sacred corn beer was offered to the sun in Africa, where sorghum brews sustained communities and honored the ancestors, and in the far north of Finland, where a juniper-flavored farmhouse ale survived for 1,000 years. We entered the quiet monasteries of medieval Europe, where monks became the world's first professional brewers, patiently recording their recipes and tending their hop gardens. We uncovered the story of Gruit, the secret herbal blend controlled by bishops and lords, and watched as hops won the centuries-long battle for the soul of beer, transforming it from a fragile local product into a stable, tradable commodity that enriched cities and reshaped the economies of Northern Europe. We met the alewives, the women who brewed in their kitchens and sold the surplus to their neighbors, and we traced the slow, painful process by which they were pushed out of the profession they had created. We read the old Bavarian purity law that has shaped the identity of German beer for 500 years. We stepped into the medieval alehouse, where beer was food, drink, medicine, and currency all at once, consumed in quantities that would astonish a modern drinker. We crossed the English Channel and discovered the world of porter and pale ale, of India Pale Ale and the Great British Pub. We wandered through the Belgian Labyrinth, a small country with 1,500 distinct beers, from wild fermented sour ales aged in oak barrels to the strong, complex brews of Trappist monks. We were there when a difficult young Bavarian brewer tapped the first golden Pilsner in a Bohemian basement in 1842, creating the style that would conquer the world. We descended into the cold caves beneath Bavarian hills, where lager was born, and watched as science finally caught up with the ancient craft. Pasteur revealed the living secret of fermentation. Hansen isolated pure yeast and gave it away to the world. Together, they transformed brewing from an art of intuition into a discipline of precision. We sailed across the Atlantic with the millions of German immigrants who carried their love of lager to a new country, building breweries in Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. We saw how railroads and refrigeration created the first national beer brands, and how those brands crushed the smaller regional operations that had given American beer its variety. We lived through the long drought of Prohibition, when the taps were shut off and an entire culture of brewing was nearly destroyed. We endured the bland consensus of the post-war decades, when American beer became the lightest, most neutral-flavored drink in the world. And then we watched the revival. A man who had never brewed a batch in his life bought a failing San Francisco brewery on impulse. A law was quietly signed that made home brewing legal again. A generation of passionate amateurs began making dark, bitter, hoppy, flavorful beers in their garages, and within a few decades they had built a movement that spread to every corner of the globe. We explored how European empires carried beer to every continent, creating iconic brands from China to Kenya while pushing aside the indigenous brewing traditions that had existed for millennia. We watched the great corporations merge and consolidate, absorbing competitors and craft brands alike in the pursuit of scale. We sat in the sacred spaces where beer is drunk, the English pub, the Bavarian beer garden, the Czech neighborhood house, the Japanese drinking place, the American taproom, each one a different expression of the same ancient human need to gather and share. We considered the complicated relationship between beer and the body, the long arc from ancient medicine to modern science, from confident claims of health to sober warnings about harm. We looked inside the modern brewhouse, where 4 simple ingredients, water, barley, hops, and yeast, are combined with a precision that would astonish the ancient priestesses of Sumer, but with a purpose they would have understood perfectly. We met the sober, curious generation, young people who want the ritual of beer without the alcohol, and we peered into a future where climate change threatens the very crops that beer depends on. And through it all, one thing has remained constant: the impulse to take grain and water and the invisible work of tiny organisms and turn them into something that brings people together. That impulse has survived the fall of empires, the rise and fall of religions, the upheavals of revolution and war, the transformations of industry and technology. It has endured because it is, at some level, a fundamental part of what it means to be human. So if you are listening to this in the quiet of the evening, perhaps with a glass of something nearby, or perhaps with nothing at all, know that you are connected, through this story, to every person who has ever raised a drink of fermented grain and shared it with someone they cared about. From a cave in the hills of Israel to a taproom in your own city, the thread is unbroken. The story of beer is, in the end, a story about us. About our curiosity, our ingenuity, our desire for pleasure and connection, and our remarkable ability to take the simplest things the earth provides and transform them into something worth sharing. Rest well tonight, wherever you are. The beer will be there tomorrow, as it has been for 10,000 years, waiting to be poured, waiting to be shared, waiting to tell its story all over again. Good night, and sleep well.